Hello, and welcome to the Left In podcast. I am here with Grego, who is originally from the Bronx, speaks Spanish, and has lived a lot of his life outside of the United States, and is a writer, has written a bunch of things online, including recently an article which got some notice about identity and race, being an American who now lives in Colombia.
Yeah. And you left out that I speak English.
You do speak English. Well, I figured people would figure that out.
I speak English fluently.
I think most people who grow up in the Bronx do. Maybe not all of them.
You can never assume. I didn't know that you were going to have an a video portion of this, and I didn't bring my signature pork pie hat.
Oh, okay.
So, all right, I'll get over it.
Yeah, I've seen your pork pie hat. I like your pork pie
signature.
hat.
It's my signature Grego look.
Yeah.
My signature Grego look.
A little bit of Charles Mingus in the house.
Exactly. The jazz men.
That works. For those of our audience who don't know, tell me a little bit about your article. I mean, I read it, but
Well, I wrote an article for the blog Medellin Guru on basically being a Black American in Colombia.
Yep.
And if there are differences or what stands out. And interestingly enough, in the process, I didn't have this at the forefront of my mind, but in the process of writing the article, I realized that my primary self-identifier is as a New Yorker.
Yeah.
Not necessarily as a Black American or as an American. Those come second and third.
Okay.
So first, I'm a New Yorker, and I realized that because as I walk around Medellin, it's my New Yorkerness that comes out first. It's my New Yorkerness that I wear as protection.
Yep.
And I just think that's very interesting. Other interesting elements are I'm Black, or I'm a Black American. Only in Colombia or only outside of the United States do I get to be an American. I think I want to be an American, but in the United States, automatically I'm seen as Black American or African American. I prefer Black American because I don't consider myself African. Right.
And part of your family is West Indian also.
Part of my family is West Indian, and I mean, obviously, I originate, or my family's originated from Africa, obviously. However, if we talk about culture, my mother's side of the family is from St. Croix and St. Kitts, and those are in between Africa and the United States, meaning in terms of the diaspora, part of my family stopped there for a few generations before coming to the United States. And then, I don't know.
And probably not by choice.
Probably not by choice, but we won't get into that. And then from my father's side, I don't know how many generations were in the United States before Africa. So my point is I'm not African. I went to Africa, and I stood out like a sore thumb. I thought I was gonna, commune with my lost brothers.
Yeah.
And I got there, and they're like, American. And I was like, wow, I'm American. And because that is the cultural identifier before anything else. And as I said earlier, New York is the cultural identifier for me. And that, in terms of New Yorkers and how we think of the country, there's New York and LA. There's nothing else.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that's I sometimes pull on this idea of race. What is race, right? Sometimes I don't think race exists at all. I think that there's culture, and then we make assumptions about culture based on, like your experience being in Africa or in Colombia. People make assumptions based on the body language and the dress, and just before you even open your mouth, they knew you were an American and not a African.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And, you know, you come here, and when I was I lived in Brooklyn for a couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
and I was the first, I don't know if I'm white. Jews didn't get counted as white in the American census until 1987. I don't know if all you know that. But let's put it this way, I could pass as white, right? But in this block in Brooklyn, I was the first white person-ish.
Yeah.
You know, my roommate's half white Jewish and half Panamanian,
Okay.
black-ish, whatever that is, you know, a little bit of Kuna Indian. But so our block was, one end of it was Dominican, the other end was like more like American black, like quote standard, whatever that is, right?
Right.
And now they didn't like each other. You know, there's a different thing, but color-wise, they're the same color.
Same.
And I didn't know what was. It took me about a month of living there to be like, that end of the block, that end of the block.
Right.
This barbershop versus this barbershop is different. It's very different, and Dominicans do not consider themselves black.
Oh, of course not. Yeah.
And then a couple blocks over is the Haitians, and they do not consider themselves black. So it's like somehow this like overlay of pigment or whatever but that's not the thing. The thing is culture.
Right. I think
Cultural
race,
group, right?
I think race, well, it's like time. Time doesn't exist.
Time doesn't exist.
Time doesn't exist. It's a convention. I mean, there's only now.
Right.
There's only this moment now.
Right.
But we have created time as a convention with which to help us manage the world. I got here at 2:30, right?
Yep.
So without that convention, we could not have settled on a time to start this broadcast. And race is a weird convention, somewhat imposed on some people by others.
It's a convention to enable categorization.
Yeah,
They both are.
yeah.
Okay, I agree with that.
And then the bad thing, or the not bad, but part of it is that it is a convention that was created 400, 500 years ago.
Yes, and
So
specifically created. And actually, one of the neat things about being down here in Colombia is that race wasn't created down here in the way it was up in America. In America, there was a very specific decision in, like, I think the 1680s in Virginia,
Right.
when the white, Irish, Scottish, British indentured servants were starting to get a little too close to the black, and both of them were all basically slaves, and they all started getting along and considering overthrowing the plantation owners. And so they created this set of laws that said only a black person can be a slave, and all of you white indentured servants, you're better than them. And they created this category, and they outlawed intermarriage, and like it was a creation.
And then the other part of that creation was that indentured servants who legally were supposed to be in their bound servitude for, say, 7 years.
7 years, yeah.
They were running away. They were like, wait a minute, I'm gonna go over to the next town,
and nobody
and no one's gonna, and they're not gonna know. And so the elite and the landowners realized, like, wait a minute, we need a new concept here. So why don't we just pick everybody that's dark, And they couldn't use Indians as slave labor
because they'd run away also.
Because the Indians knew the land and they would run away. So they took the Africans. And like, wait a minute, these Africans, they don't know the land and they're easily identifiable. So you've got a conception an artificial conception that was imposed on a group of people from 400 years ago for a specific reason, and that has just wormed its way into our psyche, into our consciousness. And I think it's starting to worm its way out, but my take on that is it took 400 years to get to where it is. It ain't leaving it in a generation. It's going to take hopefully less than 400, but it's going to take the same significant amount of time
that's really interesting
to worm its way out.
Because like I studied Judaism in seminary and stuff in Israel, and every single day we go through our prayers, recitations, we study, whatever. you were slaves for 400 years in Egypt.
And
you're not going to get over it right away. Like, it's there in the Bible. It's hitting you over the head.
And if we keep on reminding you, you'll never get over it.
Well,
right?
but that's part of, like, I think that's actually part of why the Bible is, so to speak, the world's most popular book.
Yeah.
Is that story still resonates with everybody because it's true. You're always still getting over it. If any one of your ancestors was completely ripped away from autonomy and, completely ripped away from the word freedom was only invented in languages, as far as we can tell, after slavery existed.
That makes a lot of sense.
Like, there was no such concept as slavery, as freedom.
As freedom, because...
Until there was an alternative.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I never thought about that.
So there's some really interesting things there that just, what is that? So, to bring it back to where we have a little more expertise. I mean, I've studied history of slavery and stuff like that, and but it's not. But we're here in Colombia, and one of the things I've noticed, and I think you've noticed too, more so than I have, because you've been here a lot longer, is that. So in America, somehow we got this idea of a binary. There's black people, there's white people, and then maybe there's some other races. But it's as if they're these discrete units, and then there's the one drop rule that if you have any of this in you, you're this, but only in one direction. If you got a little bit of white in you, you can still be a black person.
In one
you're a little
direction.
black in you, you're not a what's that? But here in Colombia, it doesn't seem like there's a firm category. It seems like there's definitely blacker people who get discriminated against and who come from a history of slavery, and there's American Indians who come from a different history of just abuse and conquest and whatever, and then there's like various shades of European, and then there's a lot of mixing.
Right.
But it doesn't seem like there's like one identity that just says you're a black person.
Yeah, the sense I get, and I've lived in Colombia for 5 years, in Medellin for 3, and here in Colombia I'm an American. I'm seen as an American first.
Yeah.
And then other things after that, even though I self-identify as a New Yorker. But I don't necessarily know what it's like to be a black Colombian because I'm not Colombian.
Yeah.
And so I'm learning through friends that there is a certain degree of discrimination.
Sure.
But it's not the same historical discrimination that black people have experienced in the United States. And so it's not as hard and fast.
Right.
So maybe we can just say it's softer. I don't know. But yeah, but there are
right.
lots
They
of...
didn't have a civil war to end it. It sort of ended as part of like 1851, but not for any huge political movement. It just ended. Right.
And there is mixing. I hesitated because I don't know if there's a lot of mixing or more mixing or less. But there are black populations, descendants of African slaves. There are indigenous populations, the people that were here when the Spanish arrived, and then there are descendants of the Spanish and Europeans, and so then all those 3 groups mix together.
It seems like there's a lot more mixing.
There's a lot. Yeah, that's
like on a surface level, you could look at Colombia, and in some ways it's a lot like America in that it's got that kind of like the dominant thing is European-ish, and then there's a significant black population that's concentrated in the one particular area, along the coast, and then there's the indigenous, and they're concentrated in totally different areas.
Right.
But the amount of mixing and the percentage of the population that considers itself, has some amount of indigenous or black as well as European seems to be a lot higher.
And because there is more mixing, the default that everybody just goes to is Colombian.
Yeah, you're just a Colombian.
You're just a Colombian. Now within that there may be degrees of and types of discrimination.
And there's social class here, which Americans pretend we don't have. Americans are like, what is social class? We're all middle class.
Right,
Here they're like,
right.
there are lower class people, campesinos, peasants.
Yeah.
There are middle class people, not a huge amount of them, and then there are rich people, and some of them are straight up from the conquistador families. Like, almost like old school European nobility. It's like, oh, you're from the Santo Domingo family? You're part of that.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, all of those threads of culture and ideas of mixing are very interesting. I lived in Spain for a while.
Yeah.
I lived in Barcelona, and I love Barcelona. I loved living in Spain. But Spain is a fairly homogenous society.
Yeah.
That's homogenous. Saying homogenous society is code for saying it's very white.
It's a European country. But there's mixes of those groups.
There are mixes.
You got Catalan, you got Basque, you got Spanish, whatever that means.
Well, yeah, but from my point of view, they're all the same. They're all white. And then
all you white people.
Yeah, all white people. Yeah. And then I went to France, and France Paris in particular, was very heterogeneous.
More diverse.
I'm walking down the street and I see more people that look like me.
Yeah.
And so while I loved living in Barcelona, there was a kind of breath of fresh air when I got to Paris.
Yeah.
That I liked. And I guess I bring that up because I feel that here in Colombia. And that's what I wrote about in that Medellin Guru article. I feel very comfortable here in Colombia. And I like the fact that there's a whole spectrum of people, a whole spectrum. Yeah, it adds a degree of comfort for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that the definition of you is actually very close to the definition of me here.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, you're an American. You're an American.
Right.
That's weird.
We get lumped in the same category.
Get lumped in the same category.
And in the United States, we wouldn't be lumped in that category. We'd be split up.
We'd be like, oh, not the same, not the same.
Why are you guys hanging out over there? Get spread up.
Well, maybe if we both showed up in Texas, they'd be like New Yorkers.
Easterners, Yankees. If we both showed up in Texas, that's funny.
New Yorkers, but
that's funny. Yeah.
No, but you're and I guess it's one of those things that I feel like America has sort of chosen a set of definitions that makes itself crazy. And here they don't have that definition, so they're a little, well, I don't know if they're less crazy here. They're different crazy.
Everybody from everywhere is crazy in one way or another, and that's what I guess that's the key to survival. You go someplace and you discover what's their crazy.
Yeah.
Once you know what your own crazy is, and I sometimes refer to myself as the sanest crazy person you'll ever meet.
That's a tall claim. There's some pretty sane, crazy people out there.
Yeah, there are, but and we can now move into a wholly different area of the conversation because I claim that or refer to myself as that because I've experienced mental illness and I've been hospitalized 2 or 3 times. And so I've got diagnosed or had. I like to say I had. I disclaim it now. So I had a diagnosed mental illness, went through it, and I say, because I feel it, that I healed myself. And so that's where that's not just me like laying on hands healing myself, but through the process of therapy and meds and lots of other different therapeutic practices, I came about to a healing. And so now I feel mentally very, very healthy. But at the same time, I recognize that I've got quirks.
So it's almost like you're saying you know more about sanity because you've seen it from the outside.
I know. Okay, yeah, that's right. I was going to say the opposite. I know more about insanity because I've seen it from the inside. But the way the way you phrase it is right as well.
Well, the initial point you made was you're the sanest person.
I'm the sanest crazy person.
Yeah. So how do you get there? There can be a lot of crazy people who've been inside crazy and never got out of crazy.
Right.
They know all about crazy.
They don't know that they're inside crazy.
Right. But to be able to define sanity, that's an interesting thing. Because sanity is you could say it's a very subjective thing. And when you look back in history, it was considered sane to do some stuff that now we think was completely crazy.
Sure, and I think it's the same question, but from two different viewpoints, because crazy was not necessarily definable or definable as a certain way, and so redefining it, states that if I'm able to redefine crazy, then I myself I'm not going to redefine crazy as something that encompasses me. I'm going to redefine it as something that is external to me, thereby making myself sane.
Oh, that's interesting. so you made
I could not repeat that if I had to, so don't ask.
No, you made me think of there's a Philip K. Dick short story. I think it's called Misadjustment. I forget. But it's this future where there's these mutations have spread through the population, but not everyone. And if you've gotten some of these mutations, you can distort the reality around you. So you don't know that you're not sane. Because you can actually do the thing that is crazy. So, this one person believes that he can, he's getting everyone over to his... And they have this small group of people who for some reason are, quote, immune.
Yeah.
So they walk around and they try to figure out who's really... And they test people. And, if you've got these weird mutations, they take you out of the population and kill you because they're trying to protect base humanity. Yeah. So this guy, rich guy, and he invites everybody over to his house for a special party, a special unveiling. And, he serves drinks and all these nice, hoity-toity people, and they're having hors d'oeuvres. And he says, okay, it's time. I'm going to bring you all back. He brings to the backyard, and he's got some plants in the backyard, and one of these ferns looks like a giant pod. And he unfurls the pod, and he's been growing a spaceship. And he just thinks this is the most natural thing in the world. And everybody else starts freaking out and running away, and they're like, oh my God, and then the police are going to come and take this guy away, and he realizes what went wrong. And it just was within your little sphere, it seems normal, it seems sane. So the rest of that story becomes this weird meditation on how do you really tell?
Sure.
Because if you really can have that impact on the people around you, that becomes the reality. That's what you see with some of these power-hungry people, who do these terrible things with their companies, and they make every woman sleep with them to get a part in a movie or whatever. Well, that's just the reality. I don't know. And all these people around them accept that that's the reality.
Sure.
They don't even think it's insane.
And I mean, you get to interesting dynamic, interesting question of reality. What is real? What isn't real? Sanity. What's sane and what's not sane? I have a necklace, a pendant, and it's scribed on it. It says, "I'm out of my mind." So it's to me it represents two things.
It's a double meaning.
It's a double meaning. One, I'm crazy, right? And two, I am out of my mind because being in our mind is the illness, is the sickness, because we think too much. We think too much, and that thinking gets in the way. That grows out of the Buddhist philosophy and
yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of this mindfulness stuff.
Zen and Buddhism.
That's your mind is your mind.
It's a tool to use.
But you got to recognize that it's only your mind.
It's not you.
It's not you.
It's not you.
Your thoughts are not you.
Exactly. And so, there's interesting, all of this comes to different reference points, different vantage points that are very, very interesting. I posted on Facebook just a little while ago that I was talking to a friend of mine, and she said, go pick it up on 70th Street. And I immediately knew what she was talking about. And so I went to 70th Street, meaning this small section of 70th Street because 70th Street runs the length of Medellin.
Yeah, it's huge.
But she says, go pick it up on 70th Street. And there were tickets to a concert that we're going to tonight. And I just didn't even question it. And I went to the section. I just didn't know which way to go when I got off the bus, but I picked the right way. And 2 blocks later, I was at the club and I got the ticket. So my point is, I was on the same page as she was.
Yeah.
She says, go to 70th Street, and we're both speaking Spanish. So couple of things spinning around in that for me. I speak Spanish, but if I did not have that reference point, it wouldn't even matter because I need the same, even though we speak the same language, we were speaking the same language, I need the same reference points.
Or frame of reference.
Frame of reference, so that string of words on 70th means the same thing to me. And it did, and I didn't even question it until after I picked up the ticket. And I was like, oh wow, a whole bunch of things happened in my head in this process, and it's kind of cool. So I was kind of happy because I'm kind of inculcated into this Medellin culture within Spanish to the extent that someone could say to me in Spanish, go get it on 70th Street, and I didn't even question it. I went and got it.
You knew what they meant. That's an interesting thing in terms of, like, what is language itself? Like,
Exactly.
or spoken language, words. There's some theories that almost all of the communication between us happens non-verbally. Angles, posture, whatever.
Sure.
And that if we were, there's this book, Future Primitive, by this anarchist guy named John Zerzan.
Okay.
And it's relevant to this for 2 reasons. One is he sort of questions, like, when did we start to get alienated from pure experience? If you picture, we're just like humans from whatever it is, 100,000 years ago, or however long back you want to say before we started having like actual languages. I don't know how long that is.
Right.
But if you look at, chimpanzees and these other, they clearly communicate with each other. They clearly have a whole web of ways of indicating a lot of things to each other, and they have group identities and right? And you can imagine whatever stage of humans it was, also, being able to go hunting together, and like you see this today with like army platoons. Stop. Go.
Yeah.
This way.
I see 2 tanks. Go 5.
Yeah. So we can communicate without words.
Yeah.
But symbols. But his point was even symbols. Like, at what point did we get away from just sort of this pure, whatever this, it's an ideal, but it's a great thought experiment. How do you get back to that idea? So one of his points was, at a certain point, we figured out how to make words. But coming right on the heels of that is also the ability to lie.
Oh, yeah.
Like, once you start to get symbols that aren't integrated with your whole way of expressing and everything that's sort of embedded in that non-alienated, pure, total experience,
then you lie.
Then you can lie. And you can start to create layers of abstraction and layers of, so to speak, alienation from yourself. And part of the other thing from his book that I think is really interesting, which I forget how he tied it together, but he basically says that therapists and this idea of, or psychologists, really, psychiatrists, are today's priesthood. Because back then, whenever you want to go
back then it was religion.
Some prehistory, it was pre-religion. It was
it was the witch doctor.
It was
quote unquote witch doctor.
It was either the medicine man, the shaman, or just all the elders or whatever. And there was like a sort of understanding of taboos and whatever, and certain things were in, certain things were out. And the power to decide that somebody's outside of this consensus reality by their words, by their actions, by their intentions, something.
Yeah.
That's like way more powerful than just law, in a way. And if you think about it in today's world, if you just break the law, you still have plenty of rights. But if people say you're crazy, no rights. They can just say you're crazy and they lock you up in an institution. It's not a sentence for a certain amount of time.
Well, and I'm going to add in another dynamic to that, which is
You're outside of reality.
yeah, which is prevalent in the United States today. If you're a marginalized group, for example, there are lots of cops killing black people, and the law is applied differently. The law is applied differently to black and white, meaning a black person who commits the same crime and is guilty as a white person
Gets a bigger sentence.
gets a different sentence, always more severe.
Yeah, same situation, way more likely to have the cop pull his gun, maybe shoot him.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So those are
And not always
interesting
even just white cops. It could even be black cops.
It could even be black. Exactly. And yeah, sure. So going back to what you brought into this conversation, frame of reference and culture, there are expressions in English and Spanish. We say in English every other day, right? So when you're learning Spanish and you have all of those words, the first thing that occurs to you is to say those string of words in Spanish, which doesn't mean anything to a Spanish speaker.
That idiom doesn't work.
No, because in Spanish that equivalent is de yes, de no. Right?
Oh.
That's their equivalent of every other day. And so thinking about that further,
That's what they say, dia sí, dia no.
dia sí, dia no. Dia sí, dia no.
So they wouldn't say cara otro dia.
Cada otro dia doesn't mean a thing to them.
Huh.
But then if you think about it further, what does every other day mean, even in English? If you look at those words, I mean, we have a common consensus, a frame of reference, going back to my original time doesn't exist, it's just a conception that we've invented. We've invented the conception that every other day is going to mean this thing. Because if you think about it a lot, every other day, the meaning of that can break down. And well, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. Every other day, we have agreed that this is going to mean day yes, day no.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying every other day could mean every other day except this one.
Yeah.
It could mean every day that's not today.
Exactly.
It could mean something else.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one. Bi-weekly.
Yeah.
That is a reference, is a common conception that breaks down. Because bi-weekly can mean twice a week or every other week.
Oh, even in English, people get confused.
Even in English. So that's kind of, I mean, everything.
Right, or does it mean
frame of reference.
one week I'm gay, 1 week I'm straight? I don't know.
That's excellent. I love it. Bi-weekly.
But why not?
Exactly.
Why doesn't it mean that?
If enough people decided that that's what it means, then that's what it would mean.
That's
if
interesting.
enough people decided that.
See, okay. So you're right. Language means what people agree it means. That's one of the things that's been. But that's really an organic process, right? Like if enough people agree that something means something,
right?
Like there's been a pattern in America that some people have decided they can tell other people to change the language, even though people didn't agree to it. And that, I think, is a very different dynamic. It's a little more dangerous. It's like, no, you can't say this word anymore.
Yes. Now, how language changes organically, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a teacher.
I'm not saying it's not well-intentioned. I'm just saying that ain't how language works.
Right. Now, language changes organically, I think, from the bottom up, meaning kids. And he was telling me new expressions in Spanish that are replacing other expressions. And he's like, I teach kids and work with kids, so I'm connected to how the language is changing. Yep. And slang comes up, I think, primarily from the younger people, kids, and want to create new ways of saying things, and it becomes adopted, or even small marginalized groups that are in certain respects seen as cool. The people outside of those groups start to adopt some of their culture. You see it in rap.
Oh, sure.
And other and music, and so I think you see it a lot in imposing changes, and that might not necessarily be, well, one, it's not organic, and it might not necessarily be a good thing for everybody, because they're imposing changes, which is basically they're imposing power, or they're imposing their power over somebody else.
Yes, yes. And look, I don't always say it's wrong. Like, one of the great achievements of the, civil rights era was, to say that the N-word was not something acceptable anymore.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they changed the language. In a way, all they did was they say, this is the exception that proves the rule. You can't change the language. You can't change people's minds. But now you all need to know that this particular word has this unique power, and because of that, it's just no longer acceptable. But it never went out of anyone's heads.
That's a very interesting concept, because I mentioned earlier that I don't consider myself African, and so I don't use the term in reference to myself, African American. I prefer Black American or Black, or I would ideally, within the United States, like to do away with that altogether and just be American. Now, so historically, we went from being Negroes, or first the N-word, then Negroes, then Black.
Or colored in there.
So maybe colored.
NAACP.
Negro.
They never changed the name.
That's marketing, and you've got too much to wrap. If you change it to what?
They got a logo already.
It's the
we got a logo.
We got to change it. So our identity changed for a certain way, and in terms of use of the N-word, rappers. Or there's certain people that still use it and like
rebooted it as a positive.
Yeah. So the word still exists, but it's it's like, if you use it for me, you're in trouble.
Right.
If I use it referring to myself, I can do that. I typically don't, or I typically, like, if I'm talking to my brother, it's not a word that I use. It's not a word that I like. But if he uses it in reference to something, I hear it and I understand what he's talking about, and no problem.
Yeah.
But if someone outside our group uses it, they're in trouble.
I think there was a concert. I want to say I heard about this. Was a Kendrick Lamar concert or something where he's got the whole audience singing along with one of his songs, and then he has some white girl, and she's singing a lyric that includes that. And she's singing the song. She loves the song, so she sings the word. And it's like a lynch mob. And she's like, what am I supposed to do? It's your song, and you put the mic in. Like, what am I supposed to do?
What am I supposed to do? Yeah.
You're supposed to just kind of...
blank.
Blanket? I don't know.
Yeah. Now, the interesting conventions and interesting positions people get put into. And I mean, I just look at that and say, that's interesting. I really don't have...
Right, because they put, like,
she's
that
put,
one,
yeah.
she's put in a situation where the rules broke down.
Right, and she could be the most progressive person on earth, but with the microphone in her face, and she said the N-word, and now she's anathema, she's a pariah, she's, and it's just society frequently contorts us into positions that are untenable.
Yeah.
Positions and stances that are untenable. I look at that and I'm just like, really interesting. Because I'm on the outside looking in. I don't know what I would have done were I a white person sitting in
right.
Saying, I don't know.
Right, and even if it's a whole group of people, if you're singing along with a song, if you're reading Mark Twain aloud to your class, you're a teacher and you're reading the book to your class, for one thing, it's historical. For another thing, it's like, Huckleberry Finn in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Jim is the most saintly character in that whole novel.
Right.
It's
right.
not negative.
Right.
It's just that's what they called him. That's his name in that novel.
Right.
But like trying to apply this standard, it's like it's just a mismatch of something to something. And like I feel like we're losing the ability to even have an intelligent discussion about this. Like it might be right, it might be wrong. I don't know so much care. I just care that we can't even talk about it anymore.
What you just said reminded me of something I have to go back to when we talked about the emergence of words and culture, or words and hence the ability to lie. But then there's something else. I mean, I'm a writer, and one of my favorite writers. I have two favorite writers, William Faulkner and James Baldwin.
Ah, nice.
Now, William Faulkner, I think his characterization of black people, or let's say, I think his black characters were superficial, and I don't necessarily care for them. However, his prose is some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read. His descriptions are gorgeous, and that's why I love him. That's why I love him. I don't love him for his portrayal of black people. Right? I love him for how he uses the English language. Right. But it's interesting that because I sort of have to articulate that, because as a black person, it's like me justifying. I have to justify.
Right, you have to defend it.
I have to defend.
You can't just say,
why
he's my favorite character. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, so now.
Right, like I don't have to, like I'm, Jewish, I don't have to say, like I love Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to say, even though he made Shylock a weird Jewish character.
Right.
Caricature. Like,
sure.
He did, okay, but I don't have to say it every time.
Right.
But you do. Every time you say it of a Faulkner.
Yeah.
It's a double standard.
It's interesting. And now, what had occurred to me before when we were talking about the emergence of words and language, I was having a conversation once with a friend, and he said that there's something wrong with us as writers because we experience something and then immediately we have to run home and write about it. And it's like words, words and experiences.
Yeah.
And we can't just experience it. That's not enough. We got to go home and record it or tell other people about it. And one Christmas, I remember being with a family, and they were videotaping the unwrapping of the gifts. And then as soon as the gifts were unwrapped, someone was like, okay, here, let's watch it. And I'm like, wait, we just finished doing that. Why do I have to watch us doing it? I still remember it.
Yeah.
And just yesterday I was having a text conversation with a guy about philosophy and direct knowing, and he said that he kind of left meditation, gave off or abandoned the practice of meditation because he needs to talk about stuff and direct knowing. See, and so we talked about that a bit, and I learned a lot of stuff through meditating.
Sure.
And so I don't necessarily need words. I'll need words if I want to try and communicate that to somebody else, but I don't need the words for the knowing. I've learned it through this process that's independent of the mind. Let's say it's knowing outside of the mind, or a process of learning that doesn't necessarily involve the mind. And so we had this conversation, and I'm like, well, and I think he got to a conclusion whereby he was going to go back to meditate, but he couldn't have gotten to that conclusion without our conversation, and our conversation could only happen with words.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Like, what that made me think of, fascinated with there's a book called The Guns of August.
I've heard of it. I think
it's Barbara Tuchman's history book. It's about it's about the beginning of World War One.
Okay.
And it starts with the Archduke Ferdinand, who's the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, gets assassinated, probably by the Black Hand, who's this Serbian nationalist terrorist group that wants Serbia to become, well, I guess Serbia was already sort of independent, but it was small, but it wanted to make independent the Slavic parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Okay.
So it happened in Sarajevo. And wait, that was after. No, okay, so the opening scene of Guns of August is the funeral of King Edward of England. And so they call him the uncle of Europe. Because he's literally the uncle of like 2/3 of the kings and queens of all of the rest of the countries.
Sure, because there was so much interbreeding back then.
Right, because all these alliances and whatever of all of these monarchies were intertwined. So at his funeral, there's like the emperor of Japan is there, and the German king, and the this and the that, and everybody was there. And there's this sense of just that this mattered. This kind of like communication being what you wore, how you carried yourself, the fact that you did this particular ceremony in this way as opposed to this particular ceremony in this way, and honor and nobility and class, like as like official real categories, like and part of what World War I destroyed. Actually, maybe it was the book The Rites of Spring. I forget. There's these wonderful books about World War I. The Rites of Spring by Modris Eksteins. It's this other amazing book. Something in the course of World War I gradually destroyed that. The fact that you could have this ideal that people like truly believed in, and the majesty of this really big world that included kings and queens and princesses and magic and castles and privilege in the real sense of privileged royalty and stuff, that was somehow part of the divine order of things, and that this whole order was infused with this kind of divine something that got destroyed during the course of World War I. And nobody can believe it anymore. It's like we're all too cynical. So now we all think that words are the only ways we have to communicate. Words, images, blah, blah, blah. But none of us ever quite believe that there's magic to it. And then, it's also made that science is the only real truth. And we no longer, there's a religious truth, there's a moral truth. But it's only true if you could prove it with some scientific study. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
Like, it's like we lost the handle on a bigger world.
That's really interesting, especially thinking about it from a religious context. And I'm not religious partly because of these concepts and precepts that I don't ascribe toward. And a few years ago, I went to Mass with a friend, and when we went to sit down in the pews, she did the sign of the cross, and I did it as well, but I did it with my left hand. And she's like, you don't do it, you do it with this hand, right? And that's why? And that's my question, right? Why? I do it with my left hand, probably because I'm left-handed.
Sure.
But you're not supposed to do it with your left hand. Why? Because way back in the 1300s or whenever, they thought that left was evil.
Really?
Well, yeah. I mean, left was either the side of the devil or, and so lots of things in religion you go on the right. Now, why I can't be religious is because that concept has to evolve for me.
Yeah, sure.
We're in the 21st century. Hello. The left hand is not associated with the devil. So
not for you.
Right. Never will be for me because I'm left-handed. But if the institution of religion
Yeah.
can't evolve, and I think it takes a long time to evolve. Maybe it will. Just like the concept of race leaving our I just lost the word for that.
Collective consciousness or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
I speak Spanish, and frequently when I'm speaking English, which I don't often do, I lose words.
Well, I wonder if it's like because race leaving collective consciousness, that's an interesting thing. Like I grew up in sort of an era of, I think the late 80s, early 90s is when I first started, having conscious thoughts.
Yeah.
High school, college.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, the end of the Cold War, and there was this and there was that, and there was this sense that racism was becoming a thing of the past. At least in what we were being educated to think and what should be and the ideal. And, like you were saying, the kids have a different standard. And, I noticed the older kids were way more willing to throw around insulting things than the young kids.
Racial slurs and such.
Racial slurs. With the exception, let me qualify that within our friends in high school,
Mm-hmm.
part of belonging in that group of friends was freely and regularly insulting each other in every conceivable
Well, yeah.
way.
We call it playing the dozens.
Yeah, like if you didn't.
That's what you do.
What'd you say about sleeping with somebody's mother and see, oh, your mom is so fat. And that included, like whatever insult we could think of for each guy's, group, the WAP and the kike and the, I don't know what terms are the chink and the, and we just. One of my friends is from Indian
Mm-hmm.
from high school, and for some reason the best insult we could come up with him was Gandhi. We're like, yeah, what's up, Gandhi? I don't think it's actually an insult, but it was meant as an insult. Like, what's that?
Sure, yeah.
So it was like, there is something in that like equal opportunity offensiveness.
Mm-hmm.
That also indicates a passing of the power of the insults.
Sure.
I hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that seems to have now been, that's not how it works anymore. I don't get the sense the kids do that anymore.
I don't, that's a good, an interesting question, and I don't know. I'm watching the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, the 80s and the 90s as a period when racism was on the downturn.
Well, appeared to be on the downturn from my limited perspective. I'm not going to say it actually was getting any better.
Right. Well,
but it looked like it. You were there.
I would go back and say, the civil rights movement, and I remember, the Vietnam War. I was born in '62.
Okay.
And I remember news stories. I was probably now getting up to 1968. I remember watching the news with my mother and seeing stories. I just remember I have an image in my head of the Vietnam soldier walking in the jungle with his arms slung over his rifle as he's walking down the path,
Yeah.
And that tied to, this is coming up in my head because I'm watching this documentary, which brings together, this period of time in the late 60s and the early 70s brings together the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the rise in feminism. So the early 70s, everyone thought, well, okay, or mid 70s, we've taken care of racism.
Really?
There was when black people got the right to vote, and there was the affirmative action.
Yeah.
So I would say between the mid 70s and now, or the mid 70s and Obama,
right?
I would say, okay, yeah, we thought we took care of racism.
Yeah.
And now that we're in, perhaps we can call it a post-Obama era, right, with our current president, and there's a resurgence of racism. And then there's also a recognition that institutionally it hasn't left. And I think those ideals are shocking to the psyche, and it makes me think that perhaps that is a similar type of shock that happened to folks around World War One, when the idea of the aristocracy,
when the ideals were believed in,
were destroyed.
Yeah.
When those ideals crumbled, right? When it was like, well, now, I mean, obviously, the United Kingdom still has its monarchy, but it's not the same.
Ain't the same.
And Spain has a monarchy, and but likewise, it's not the same.
And you wouldn't fight a war in the same way for the same reasons, for the glory of your
right. Well, now we fight wars for different. And this is actually very, very, very interesting, because we fight wars for different reasons now.
Yeah.
We fight wars for economic reasons, and it's not even us fighting, meaning the citizens. It's the government mounting a war and using the citizens, which always happens, but the reasons are different. The economic reasons, they're
and we don't even know the real reasons. And my brother works for the Pentagon and in policy, but the actual reasons why we decided to go to war with Iraq or whatever, it's not clear that the stated reasons are the reasons.
Well,
they might be good reasons.
What were the stated reasons?
Reasons?
I mean, the stated reasons were, we've got to get rid of these people that are anti-American, but I see the reason as oil. We want to control oil.
Well, so my brother met a guy in the policy, making group of the Pentagon. That they have contingency plans in the Pentagon to invade every country in the world. Which isn't every military planning unit in every country
is supposed
to do that for at least a couple hundred years. It's not doesn't mean that America's more warlike than anyone else.
No.
America is more warlike than anyone else, but that's not the reason why. That's not the reason why. Okay, but so they say so they plan. So they always have these acronyms for the operations.
Mm-hmm.
There was this Operation Desert Shield, and then was that 1991 in Kuwait or something,
mm-hmm.
and I think they do this in Israel too. They have Operation Grapes of War or whatever for one of the whatever it is. So they got a name for the operation. So this guy
mm-hmm. tried
to call the name for the Iraq invasion. It's like, okay, if we're going to do this, it's called Operation Iraqi Liberation. It sounds totally logical. We're going to go liberate Iraq, but the acronym is OIL. And so he was kind of hoping that no one would notice and that it would get published that we're going to do Operation Iraqi Liberation.
But someone said, no, we can't. Yeah,
someone not all bureaucracy is stupid. Sometimes they're but I'm not sure that it really was. I think there was actually a lot of moral reasons to go into Iraq. Maybe not at that time, maybe not in that way, but the axis of evil, and he said, if you're a state sponsor of terror,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you no longer have the right to be.
Right.
Okay.
To exist.
Saddam Hussein was a state sponsor of terror.
Yeah.
Not against America, but against Israel. He would pay $25,000 to the family of every suicide bomber against Israel. Wow. State sponsor of terror. And if you're going to be consistent with that logic, which I think Bush, I'm not going to say he's good, bad, anything, but if that was why,
mm-hmm.
then we go to war with Iraq. That's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also the whole idea of going to a war, they always make these calculations. Is it winnable? Is it, how would you have an exit plan? And that bothers me on a sort of more moral level, because I think there's only one reason to ever go to war.
Mm-hmm.
It's because it's the right thing to do.
Now,
it doesn't matter if you're going to lose. If it's the right thing to do, you go to war.
I think, sure, the statement makes sense. I don't agree with it.
Fair enough.
I think there's only one reason to go to war, and that's if somebody attacks my house. Or if someone, with my house. If my house is the United States, If someone attacks the United States, then we go to war.
Okay.
That's and even more so watching this Vietnam documentary.
Well,
it's
yeah.
kind of I'm affected by it today.
It's
hitting me hard.
Yeah.
But I've always felt that, for example, I would not enlist in the army unless there was a threat to the physical territory of the United States. And unless conceivably armies can be invading the Bronx.
Right.
There's no other reason for me to go to war. Now, I can't. My brother and I were talking about this the other day. When folks, say, thank you for your service.
They'd skip the Bronx. They would just leave that alone. You can keep that.
See, now here's the thing. They wouldn't be able to skip the Bronx because the Bronx is the only borough that's connected to the continent.
Yeah, you're right.
So they would have to. Now, that's where we beat them back. That's where we beat them back.
Yes.
But the Bronx is the only borough connected to the continental United States. All the other boroughs are islands. But anyway, so my brother and I were talking, and he says that he cannot say to a soldier, thank you for your service. Because he might understand the ideas behind which an individual might join the army and fly overseas and fight, but he does not agree that that act is serving a citizen in the United States.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I agree with that, and that's where that forms my idea of not going to war unless my house is attacked.
Well, that's interesting too, because, and I'm not saying you're in denial, but I think most Americans are in denial that America is an empire.
Oh, I certainly am not. However, I don't think it's an empire that should exist. And as an empire, I mean, what gives, just because we're an empire, just because the United States is an empire, I think that in and of itself is evil.
Well, so the reason that I tugged on that thread, America has 100, I think, bases in 130 other countries.
Oh, no doubt. America, I agree 100%. Like, America is an empire.
Like, by any definition,
that's an empire.
Except for our own weird double talk these days. America is not only an empire, but it's the biggest empire the world's ever seen.
Yeah.
We got army bases in the Philippines and in India and in, I don't know where, everywhere.
Sure.
It's hard. Sure. It's hard. It's hard to find countries we don't have bases.
Yeah, probably easier to count.
I guess we don't have a base in Russia, probably.
Is there a base in Colombia?
Well, yeah. Well, there's a lot of American troops here. There's a lot of American. There's DEA troops and there's counterinsurgency troops.
When you say
special forces,
DEA troops, what does that mean?
I don't even really know. there are armed people who work for the
United States government,
drug enforcement
agency.
Whatever I don't know the acronyms, but there's definitely an American presence here. Okay. I don't know if there's an actual base in that, but probably.
Right. But an American presence, that's enough.
Israel officially doesn't have any American bases, but apparently there's a base in the desert that is an American Air Force base.
Oh, interesting.
But it's not official. But even in Damascus, in Syria, in spite of all of the civil war and all of the craziness, there's still a Defense Department office. Not a base, but there's a building where the Defense Department cooperates with the Syrian Defense Department, even in the middle of all the craziness going on over there.
Okay.
So America has this empire and has this, and I guess the reason I'm saying it, and this is actually one of the Obama era changes, I don't know that the world would be any better off. It's not zero sum, meaning like World War II made us all realize that the world is a big, ugly, dangerous place. And then if you let something fester somewhere, it can come bite you in the ass. I mean, there's nowhere, for all intents and purposes, there's nowhere further in the universe from, Washington, D.C. than Japan.
Right.
But they left Japan alone for a couple decades, and suddenly Japan was conquering, a third of the world and attacking the United States. So sometimes you can't just leave it alone. So I think America realized there needs to be a global policeman, and it's better that it's us than anyone else.
Okay. So
that means sometimes you have to fight these small wars. Yeah. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying I understand there's a logic to it.
Now, I've been, and actually in thinking about what I might talk about today on this podcast, and also in watching this documentary, if World War II defined that,
yeah,
right, I believe Korea and Vietnam were the opposite definition. I mean, literally, we went into Vietnam because of the domino theory, which stated that, if one country goes communist, they'll all fall, which was proven not to be true. And I don't think we learned from that. So you're saying so you're saying we have to let, because of Japan and the lessons from Japan and the lessons from World War II were that, we need to be global policemen. And I believe that the lesson from Vietnam was that we don't need to be global policemen.
That's interesting. I mean, I think it's actually a little trickier than that. And I think this actually applies to the Iraq War also.
Mm-hmm.
So, we intervened in Korea. North Korea invaded South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
We intervened to protect South Korea. They were separate occupation zones after World War II. Okay.
Right.
So we kept communism from taking over South Korea.
Right.
And Vietnam is a mess in 100 different ways.
Right.
But it wasn't happening in a vacuum. In the Philippines, we had beaten back a communist insurgency. We had helped a local guy beat back a communist insurgency successfully. Mm-hmm. In Malaysia, the British had helped the anti-communists defeat the communists. In Indonesia, there was a huge wave of unrest that culminated in about 1 million people being killed that were allegedly communists. But there was allegedly a chance that Indonesia would go communist too.
Mm-hmm.
After Vietnam, Cambodia did go communist. And I think Laos also. And with horrible human consequences. So it's not like it was there wasn't no reason to stop the spread of communism. Vietnam was just not the place to do it.
Wasn't no reason. I'm sorry, I can't
understand that.
It
It's a double negative.
It wasn't.
There were good reasons.
I want my cookies with no nuts.
I know. There were good reasons to say communism is bad. There were good reasons to say we don't want it to spread.
Okay. But given that Vietnam was
not the place and the way to do it, and.
Okay, so let's jump ahead a little bit to the Middle East and some of our activities there, which always seem to create the next anti-American group.
And that might be true, but even there, so
we're policemen, but the fact that we're there policing creates more criminals that then we have to police against.
But they might have been anyway. We did what we did to Saddam, and within a few months later or something, Muammar Gaddafi gave up all of his chemical weapons programs because he said, you know what, I'm next on this list. I don't want to get invaded. So sometimes you do this, it's games theory. You do this, and then this and this and this gets solved. Even though this looks like a disaster.
But see,
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that.
But you're not saying I'm right either.
I'm saying good things sometimes happen because you're holding a line here.
Yeah, and I'm saying that nobody is going to become anti-American and want to fly and blow up towers if America is not there.
Well, that's interesting.
So global policemen. Somebody has to do it, and I'm like, no, we don't have to do it. Let's stay here. Let's stay home, and take care of our country, take care of our poor, and not deal with.
But I'm going to push back on that because, all right, in the 90s, America had two major interventions. Not in the Middle East itself, but around the Middle East, Muslim stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, both of them on the sides of the Muslims.
What were the two interventions in the 90s?
We intervened in Yugoslavia.
Okay.
To protect the Bosnian Muslims against the Serbs.
Mm-hmm.
And we intervened all throughout the 80s in Afghanistan to help the religious Muslims overthrow the Soviet Union occupation and the secular Afghanis.
Mm-hmm.
We were on their side.
Mm-hmm.
So before we did any of the other stuff, they were already on the road to being super anti-American, despite us having helped them. So I don't know that you can say that what we did caused them to hate us in any linear progression. I mean, the reasons Osama bin Laden gave for us to be the evil enemy
mm-hmm.
was that we had army bases in Saudi Arabia,
yeah,
which were nowhere near Mecca and Medina.
Right.
But he said, because you have a presence there, that was the reason that he gave.
Yeah.
What? It's not our fault that the Saudi government wanted some military bases there because they're in a rough neighborhood and they have their own problems. They're not good people. They're a slave society. I'm not going to say that there's anything particularly defensible about the Saudi Arabian government, but they're stable and they wanted the American military presence there to prevent God knows what, Iranian invasions, jihadi invasions, who knows what. Yeah. And it was like, no, this is a crazy ideology that was not a response to what we did. And I think it is fair to say that we helped the Mujahideen in Afghanistan
mm-hmm.
defeat a superpower. But the funny thing about that, have you read Charlie Wilson's War?
I saw the movie. Does that count?
No. No, you got.
I saw the movie, and actually, one of my points was perhaps what I learned from that movie in particular, is that we seem to be really, really willing to help when it comes to funding arms and blowing stuff up and killing people, but we really don't care about helping when it comes to building schools.
No, you're right.
And so we
try.
Let's help. Come on.
That's another kind of help that sometimes doesn't work very well.
Okay.
But what we did when we supported the Mujahideen,
mm-hmm.
for a number of reasons, we had to do it kind of discreetly, CIA and whatever. Because if we did it too overtly, the Russians would be like, "You're helping. We're going to escalate."
Yeah.
So the Russians knew what was going on, but couldn't quite say, "Okay, now we're going to escalate and go to war with America."
Right.
Right. So they would transship, and actually Israel wound up being some of the sort of transshipment and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't want the Mujahideen to know that it was American or that it was Israeli in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So they, put labels on all the boxes and everything so that as far as the Mujahideen were concerned, and remember, this is like a crazy group of religious
mm-hmm.
fanatics.
Mm-hmm.
As far as they're concerned, the guns are coming from Allah.
Sure.
Allah helped them defeat
Allah provides.
Allah
provides.
And helped them defeat a superpower, and they don't even know that it was America that helped them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them. So it gave them this confidence that Allah can help us defeat anyone else. If we could beat the Soviet Union, who was pretty badass,
sure,
then we could beat America too. So I think the blowback was more because of the lie. You know what I mean? If we had been overtly and proudly standing with them, they wouldn't have been able to say America's the great Satan.
Sure. The thought that popped into my head and it's just crazy as an American, is that America is the great Satan. And I'm thinking, for example, about what the CIA does. I mean, in Vietnam in particular, the CIA, in order to gain access points into the depth of the territories,
Yeah.
made deals with the drug traders,
Yeah.
right? Which a direct result of that was, you know, the you're supposed to automatically know what this means because I can't find the word for it.
The corruption just scaled up.
Not the corruption, no. Was the influence and the flooding of American communities with drugs.
Oh.
The flooding of American communities with drugs because the CIA made deals with drug traffickers in Southeast Asia and turned a blind eye because those drug traffickers allowed them access to for military and material.
That's actually a lot like Colombia.
Okay.
That the CIA. Did you see this movie American Made with Tom Cruise?
Yes.
It's a true story.
Yeah. Oh, so there are movies, okay, but not Charlie Wilson's War? Come on, man. Come on, man.
I'm just saying.
I watch movies.
I
read, but I also
like
watch movies.
the Charlie Wilson's War movie, but the full story that unfolds in the book is so rich in detail.
Sure.
It's so much more astonishing.
Sure, the full story is never going to get told in a movie.
It's just stunning.
So I got an hour and a half. I got 2 hours. You know, show me.
Right. Well, so you're with the Vietnam. You're taking your whole 13 episodes, like 15 hours worth of.
Well,
but one at a time. One
at a time. But then also, I read a lot about Vietnam.
Yeah.
I read a lot about Vietnam from when I was in school, which is one of the reasons that made me keen on watching the documentary.
Yeah.
So.
No, but I'm only learning about Colombia. I mean, since I've been here, it makes a lot more sense to me. You know, here we got this map of Colombia on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
You could read about it, you could watch the show Narcos, but until you're actually walking around Medellin, you don't get the same sense of it. And both in Narcos and in American Made and whatever, you get the sense that there was this sort of counterproductive triangle that the DEA and the official and the police and whatever was saying were against drugs.
With one hand,
but on the other hand, the CIA is helping, supporting, protecting the drug trade,
right,
in order to fund some of the anti-communist paramilitaries, and sort of playing them against each other and messing with it.
That to me lends credence to my argument of
Great Satan.
Exactly, and being a world policeman, you can't win because if we were exclusively, for lack of a better term, isolationist, and only dealt with our own boundaries, we're not going to deal with the world. Then we wouldn't be getting into these situations where one hand does one thing and the other hand does another thing.
But to me, the easy counter argument to that is Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
Tibet is beyond the reach of the American Empire.
Mm-hmm.
China is, big. We lost a war to them already in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
We might have fought the Korean War to a stalemate, but once the Chinese intervened, they kind of kicked our ass.
Yeah.
And they ended the war several hundred miles forward of where they started the war. So we ain't fighting the Chinese again anytime soon.
Right.
We shouldn't.
Right.
They're bad. They're scary.
Yeah.
They're still communist.
Mm-hmm.
They're colonist.
Mm-hmm. And so they're imperialists.
They're imperialists. And they have violently expanded Chinese culture and people into northwest China, which I guess is the Xinjiang province, which is like Muslim and Buddhist.
Okay.
And into Tibet.
Okay.
Which is Dalai Lama Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of the reports are that they've killed, 1 million, 2 million people. There's been uprisings. They've destroyed the monasteries. They've destroyed the culture. They're wiping them out.
Mm-hmm.
America can't do shit about it.
Can't.
We could.
We can't. No, we can't.
But for all intents and purposes, We can't. And I think if we weren't the world's policeman in a lot of other places, you'd see a lot more of that.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, one of the consequences of us losing the Vietnam War, and again, I'm not saying we were on the right side of that war or anything, but we weren't totally on the wrong side of that war, and there legitimately was a lot of positive democratic stuff that wound up happening in South Vietnam towards the end of it. But when we pulled out Cambodia, it was just like we just abandoned it. We were like, we destabilized it, we bombed it, we caused it to collapse into this weird civil war, and then by 1975 there's this Maoist dictator. Well, I don't know.
Right, but we also pulled out 10 years too late.
All true, but I'm saying that when we really washed our hands of the region, genocides happened.
Which would not have happened had we left 10 years earlier.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. Like, these are counterfactuals that you can never know. The other example of that is Somalia was, I think, 1992. And we tried to intervene as good guys. And it legitimately was like we tried to protect humanitarian convoys of food, getting to starving people. Like, it really was as little imperialist as it could get. We had no desire to occupy. We had no desire to change the government. We were just like, let some food get to the starving people.
Right.
And the warlords didn't let us.
Yeah.
We sent in a little bit, and there was a firefight, and they killed 18 Americans, and we killed about 1,000 Somali gunmen.
Not something I should be laughing at.
No, I mean, but it was a shitstorm. But it made us gun shy. And then just a couple of years later, Rwanda is whipping up,
sure.
And we were like, after Somalia, we're just not dealing with it. And the whole world knew it was going to happen. You know, I mean, you've read some of this stuff.
Yeah, sure. And I when Rwanda was happening, or right on the heels of it, I worked at CARE. And so I have some knowledge of all that. And I can be a proponent for
humanitarian intervention.
Well,
whatever that means.
Before I get to that, I would say a world police force with teeth.
Right. You're saying more like UN rather than US.
Right. Because what happens in my head is all of these things devolve to our own imperialistic and personal interests.
If it's an individual country doing it.
If it's an individual country, and when I say us, I'm speaking as an American. I mean, I am still an American, even though I'm living in Colombia. And I should say, just for the record, that I relocated to Colombia for personal reasons. I thought my life would be better here, easier to make ends meet, and more enjoyable. And that's why I came here, and I did not relocate here for social reasons. So I still very much identify as an American, and
You do have a good time here.
I do have a good time here, and my life is better. My life is easier. And I lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which has a low cost of living.
Yeah.
And even in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I had to, I didn't have a good day job. I was a struggling writer. And so I always had to find something else to do to make ends meet. And in Colombia, I'm a writer. I'm not a struggling writer. Meaning,
you found your niche, and it's enough.
Yeah, it's enough, and it's not that much. But
it goes a long way.
But in Colombia, the ends meet. The ends meet, and in the United States, the ends don't meet. So my point being, I didn't come here for social reasons, meaning the social unrest that's going on in the United States against minority populations and immigrant populations, the xenophobia and all of that stuff. I actually feel the urge to go back to the United States.
Fight the good fight.
And yeah, I do. My brother sometimes has to talk me down, and he's like, "Look, just stay where you are and write. You don't want to be here." You know, and folks that are in the cities, friends, they're like, it's scary. But anyway, my point is, I still identify. I'm still an American, so I speak as an American. And when I say us, I mean, us Americans, this is what I think we should do.
Yeah, and I slip back and forth between we being America. I mean, I'm born in America. I'm born in New Jersey, grew up on Long Island. Went to an Ivy League college. Had, maybe if I had the mentality to it, I could have gone in the direction of the American elite and worked on Wall. I did work on Wall Street for a short time.
Right, because you went to Yale, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where all of the political elites
a lot
come
of
from,
a lot of
right?
Yale, Harvard, Princeton, whatever.
I went to Cornell. What political elites come from Cornell?
Yeah, it's also Ivy League.
It is also.
No, and really, yeah, both of us, in a way, have less in common with most Americans. We're elite Americans. We went to the Ivy League.
Yeah.
We're smart. We know how to talk. We read Faulkner. I mean, this is not a conversation between your everybody. I mean, I hope a lot of people read Faulkner, but I don't know.
Yeah, I would say, like, people, I would want everybody to read Faulkner, but not everybody has the time or the space. And we had the space.
Right. Well, and also, so I mean, you're a decade and change older than me, but okay. But
Wait a minute. How old are you?
You're 62. I'm 74.
I'm 55. Thank you very much. Okay,
No,
I'm sorry,
born
56.
Born in 62.
Okay.
Born in 74.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. Okay. Damn. I gotta swallow that. It's just when you call somebody a decade older, it makes it seem like a lot.
Well, life experience, it's a big difference, I think. That
Sure.
You grew up, you remember the 70s. I don't remember the 70s. You remember some of the 60s.
Yeah,
My
right.
first
You're
memories
right.
are the 1980s.
You're right.
That's a big difference.
That is a big difference. And I remember, I mean, technically, I participated in the civil rights movement. I remember a demonstration that my mother, I was, 6 or 5, but I remember being in a walk.
In the Bronx?
In the Bronx, that was for civil rights.
That's cool.
I remember that's what it was for. I had to be born in 62, say maybe 65, 66, 3 or 4? Okay, maybe I'm misremembering.
Well, there were civil rights marches all the way up to 68, 69,
yeah,
70.
but now that I think about it directly and consciously, I think it was a reactionary march to Kennedy's assassination.
No, to Martin Luther King's assassination.
No, I mean Kennedy for some reason.
Oh, Robert Kennedy.
President Kennedy.
President Kennedy, you were only a year old. I don't think.
Okay, so then Robert Kennedy.
Robert Kennedy.
So then it had to be King.
Robert Kennedy was 68.
68. So it had to be King. In any event, I remember participating in a march and when I say participating, I mean a child walking, holding his mother's hand.
Oh yeah.
So okay, either King's assassination or a civil rights march or
Robert Kennedy
or Robert Kennedy, but something around that.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, I also remember seeing news stories on the news for the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Well, the reason I was actually going in a different direction than that.
Okay.
About economics. About there was this unique window in time. Starting in, let's call it 1941, when America shifted over to a war economy. Up until then, it's the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Everybody's poor.
Yeah.
Tiny number of people are not, but everybody's
poor.
Sure.
World War II is what brought us out of the Depression.
Right, and it brought everybody up. Almost everybody had a chance at a job, had a vastly improving standard of living, and up until World War II, there was Jews were a discriminated group in America. But still Italians, Irish, everybody was prejudiced against everybody. Was prejudiced,
Sure.
And somehow World War II, and then the post-war prosperity, when the rest of the world was in ruins, America was half of the world economy. And we've got this huge boom that lasted for 20 years, and everybody in America had a chance at massive improvement in quality of life.
The American dream.
The American dream. And for sure, redlining at that point sort of systematically excluded black people from part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But even in spite of that, black standards of living improved pretty dramatically.
Sure, I agree with that.
But what's happened since the 80s, and this affects all of those white groups too,
Mm-hmm.
is that, I mean, I guess they say real wages stopped increasing in about 1973. Productivity, capital growth, all those things keep going up.
Yeah, yeah.
But your relative purchasing power with a
Mhm.
job, with a regular job, unless you're in a certain tiny subset of either finance or high tech,
Yeah.
your job gets you less.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one earner family at an auto factory or a civil service job was enough to get a nice house
Sure.
with a yard
Yeah.
and a two-car garage. And since then, I mean, my generation and my younger brothers and stuff, like, unless you're super on track all the time,
Mm-hmm.
you're never going to get out of debt.
Now, I agree with you, and when I reference the social unrest, I sometimes specifically reference it from my point of view as a black American, but I think revolution is coming to the United States.
Revolution.
I think revolution. I think we're witnessing the fall of the American empire, and I think the revolution in the United States is not going to be racial, but it's
not going to be liberal conservative.
it's not going to be liberal. It's going to be primarily class.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be this huge block of on one side, immigrants, but I guess I want to say descendants of immigrants and minorities and the lower class, the disappeared middle class, because our country is now clearly an oligarchy, and it's going to be those groups.
And it's easier to see from outside. Now that we're out of America and we look at it, maybe it's a little easier to see.
Perhaps. I don't know, because I don't know, but that's what I feel. I feel
keep talking about this. I'm just going to refill because there's really good Colombian coffee in Colombia. So you keep talking. I'm just going to go grab my French press here. So just what do you mean by a revolution?
I think what I mean is those groups that I mentioned are going to realize that we're getting short shrift, and we're going to rebel against the political and the social establishment, the super rich that own 1%, and that's what's coming. Now, you talked about perhaps that's easier to see as we're out of the country, and like I say, like always, I reference my brother a lot. Like I told him, I want to be there. I want to be in the country.
What does your brother do?
He does a bunch of things. He's a DJ, a house music DJ.
Nice.
And he skis, so he manages
that's right. You said
a ski lodge.
He goes back and forth.
Yeah, and then he works in the place is called Wind Cave. It's part of the national parks in South Dakota.
Right, and you said he's going to be in Oregon this coming.
He's going to be in Oregon managing or working. I don't know, maybe.
Because I want to spend this winter. I want to spend this winter as a ski bum, so maybe he hooks me up.
Yeah. I think he's got to get hooked up first.
Yeah. Okay.
But in any event, so I wonder, there is a certain amount of perhaps direct knowing that one can get when one is in a place. But in today's 21st century of globalization, a significant portion of our information is we would get the same way. For example, news and television news, print media, radio, you can still consume here. I can consume United States media and news outside the country. So my question is it that I'm realizing these things because I'm outside? Or is it that I think these things are just as realizable inside or outside? Because it's not, the only difference is what I might feel and stumble into on the street as I'm walking. Those types of interactions and the and impromptu conversations with people. However, impromptu conversations with people can still happen via social media and do happen. So I think
Yeah,
you get
and
the
that's
same
actually
amount of information.
and the social media conversations sometimes are good, but very often devolve into this, polarizing stupidity.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason that I'm moving into this podcasting space is I've been really impressed with this slice of the podcasting space where we're having these long conversations where you actually can get out of left-right stupidity and really get into the depth of your history experience, my history experience, and really think some thoughts that I couldn't have thought of alone, you couldn't have thought of alone, but that don't fit either of these, sort of standard narratives of stupid libertarian capitalism or stupid, I don't even know what to call the standard democratic line in America. But you're right. It feels like an oligarchy. And I actually, when you say we, I say we. I did grow up in America. But as soon as I was out of college, I started exploring. And by the time I was 26, I was living in Israel. And I lived there for over 10 years.
Okay.
And I voted in elections there. And
interesting.
So I would say we. Sometimes I mean we Jews. I mean we Israelis. And I'm not sure which one's stronger on any given day. You know what I mean?
See, now that's interesting because I have only lived out of the country in two places. I lived in Spain from 97 to 2001.
Yep.
And now Colombia from 2013 to the present moment. And with all of those experiences, I've never stopped identifying as American.
But the opening wasn't necessarily there for them to say, you're Spanish now, or you're Colombian now.
Yeah, never.
Whereas I get to Israel, and they roll out literally a red carpet.
Really?
When I made my immigration flight...
Okay, you said literally.
I said literally. I made my immigration flight. There's this organization, semi-nonprofit called Nefesh B'Nefesh.
Uh-huh.
And you fly in on a plane... It means soul basol, whatever. It's like one of these Hebrew terms.
Okay.
And I think I was on the third Nefesh B'Nefesh flight ever in 2003. And you get off the plane, you walk down the walkway, not just get into the airport like regular. You walk down the walkway onto the ground.
And
some people
external in the
kiss the
tarmac.
ground.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And there's I don't remember if it was actually red, but there was a carpet. There was a carpet, and you walk along the carpet, and there were people greeting you.
Wow.
And Shimon Peres, the former premier of Israel, president of Israel, was the first person to shake my hand
Really?
And everybody gets off the plane, he's there to shake everybody's hand. So,
wow.
There's this completely different experience of being like, oh, this is your homeland. And part of the reason I moved there was because when I visited, just the visceral experience, I grew up in America, Long Island, but I was always conscious that we're Jewish, and we grow up under the shadow of the Holocaust. My grandfather, one of my grandfathers served in World War II. The other one was had bad eyesight. He couldn't get in, but he really wanted to, and he wound up working for the munitions industries during World War II, and wanted to fight the war, and but my grandfather would rant, whenever he got going on a family meal. Why didn't FDR bomb the tracks?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't the Allies stop the Germans from killing more Jews? They knew they were killing Jews. Why didn't they stop them from killing more? And me as a historian, I could say there was a sheer level of disbelief and bafflement that the Allies were like, why are they doing something that's not helping them win the war?
Yeah, and it couldn't be possible, right? That's one of the things.
I mean, they knew. The highest levels knew. Churchill, FDR. They knew what was going on. They might not have known the full scale of it, but they knew that there was mass murder going on.
Okay.
But I think their attitude was, we're going to focus on the things that help us win the war.
Yeah.
First.
Right.
And this comes a little back to what we were saying about the empire.
Yeah.
Part of one of the greatest things I think Obama ever said was, no easy decisions make it to my desk.
Ah, yeah, sure.
If there was a decision that was easy, where the consequences of this are good and the consequences of this are bad, somebody lower down would have made the decision.
Yeah.
it only gets to my desk if you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Like, all the decisions are like that.
Sure.
And he made a lot of wrong decisions,
Yeah.
but I can't say that in his shoes I would have made so many different decisions.
Right.
There's a few. I would have put a few bankers in jail for the 2008 thing. Maybe a lot of bankers in jail. Not just because they were guilty, but because I think it destroyed Americans' faith in the financial system.
Mm-hmm.
Is that when we know that trillions of dollars got stolen, we know that the cost of everything got out of whack, we know some people made out like bandits and got away with it, and we know the president is saying everything's okay, there's growth, but we'll regulate them a little more. No, bullshit. Like, somebody needed to go to jail, and because they didn't, that's why we're headed for a revolution. It's not necessarily, I'm not sure I agree with you.
That's part of it.
That's a huge part of it.
I think that's part of it.
I'm not sure it's going to be a class revolution. I think what I see happening, partly because of that, and partly because of the way media and social media work, and partly because we're just at a stage of technology and population and movement that we don't have the, there's a word in Hebrew, kalim, the vessels. Mm-hmm. We don't have the containers to hold the understandings that we need for the reality that we're in.
Ah, sure.
Things have changed so much.
We can't wrap our minds around it.
We cannot wrap our minds around it. We're trying. This conversation does a better job than a lot of things out there. Mm-hmm, but most people, you know, you just, like, maybe science fiction is getting close to it in some ways. Mm-hmm. Some of the best science fiction is like, if you look at it way out here like this, maybe you can see it a little more clearly.
Yeah.
But I think it's similar to what happened. One of my favorite writers is a guy named David Graeber. I'll send you all his stuff because I love him. He's great. But he said that, where's our flying cars? He's about your age.
Okay.
He said, where's our flying cars?
Yeah, true.
Like, every decade from the 1880s, all of a sudden you're starting to get sanitation. You got clean drinking water. Hey, that's a huge improvement. Hey, then you got penicillin. And it works. Mm-hmm. And you're not risking death all the time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you got the bicycle. And then you got the car. And then you got the plane. And you could fly. Humans could fly. Oh my God. Like, every few years there's this, like, mind-blowing improvement. Then you got refrigeration. Then you got chemicals. Like, what kind of chemicals? The chemicals that make it possible to produce enough fertilizer to feed everybody, so you're not constant. Up until the 1870s, everybody's always wondering if there'll be a bad harvest and you'll all die.
Yeah, okay.
And then you got, you know, the electric grid and everybody, and then consumer products, and then you've got, you know, international travel and jet engines, and then you got World War II, and then you got the nuclear bomb and nuclear power, and then in the 50s you're going to space. And the Russians send somebody to space. Mm-hmm. And then in the 60s, we go to the moon. Mm-hmm. And everybody thought in the 70s, we'd go to Mars. In the 80s, we'd have flying cars. In the 90s, we'd be colonizing the moons of... Decade by decade. But since the 70s, what's happened? But we have computers? Like, they knew there would be computers. Mm-hmm. We have cell phones? Yeah, our cell phone is more powerful than NASA's computing power when we went to the moon. But we use it to play stupid video games and porn. Like, you know, it's not like we're really improving.
That's really interesting because, okay, maybe 30 years late, you know, what year is it? 2018. And they're not necessarily, you know, a flying car in every garage. But there are flying cars.
Well, that's one of the interesting things is that they have had the technology to do a lot of these things.
No, but there actually are.
They exist, but they've kind of squashed them. In 1999, I think I read an article that they had perfected a little personal helicopter with a motor the size of a lawnmower. Yeah. Like, a really simple thing, and it worked really well. And then I never heard about it again. And it was like, where'd it go?
I have seen...
Got squashed.
I've seen a number of Facebook videos,
recently,
so I know it's true.
Yeah,
I saw it on Facebook, so I know it's true.
Recently, those little jetpack things.
No, I've seen flying car videos. Flying cars, okay. You know, on Facebook, so it has to be true.
But it could have been here since you know, like the bullet trains. That was an innovation of 1957.
Right, but then the bullet train is only in Japan. How come
Japan
there's
and
no
France,
there's
France,
no
they got
okay, but how come there's no bullet train from
New York to DC?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's
Amtrak. This is like Amtrak,
terrible.
and I think there's still smoke coming out of the first car.
I know.
It's just it's
But
that's a coal engine.
This is kind of my point. To me, it goes with the wages thing. From the 70s, our wages stopped going up, and our mind-blowing technological advances stopped. Like, yeah, they give us a tiny bit of drip drop.
Okay.
I'm not saying there's a they. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy. I'm saying there's something that it's part of the cognitive dissonance.
Now, I will say
something is missing.
And I will say there is a they, even though I'm not saying it's a conspiracy.
Expand on that.
If that makes any sense.
No, it does. It does.
I don't think there's a round table with people saying, let's keep this away from them and let's keep that away from them. And I don't believe that, but I do believe that there is a group of people, the they, and they're trying to figure out how they can make even more money. I don't think it's let's take this away from them, but I do think it's wait, this is going to make me a whole lot of money.
Right.
And
okay.
that's the driver.
I'll agree with that also because when I was a consultant for Bristol Myers Squibb, big pharmaceutical company.
Yeah.
And we helped them. This was in 1997. Yeah, we looked at all of their spend, and this is when computers finally became something that you could link up all around the world. And so they used to have every production facility had its own local scientists buy their own supplies. For whatever.
Like from Staples.
I don't know if there was a Staples thing.
When you say buy their own supplies, I'm thinking of like a teacher has to buy their own supplies.
Well, no, not like personally. No, Bristol Myers Squibb paid for it.
Okay.
But the local facility had a budget, and they would buy, their beakers and their flasks and their lab coats and their copiers and their whatever. Right? So they had facilities all over the world. Makes sense.
Yeah.
But so what we did was we said, well, we can centralize your purchasing of everything. So we could cut one bulk deal and buy one order of lab coats for every facility around the world. And that meant, integrating all of this into one big computer system and how much money is being allocated for this kind of research, because you realize cost savings that way, right? Huge cost savings.
That's the impetus behind it.
Yeah, and we saved them, in the period that I worked on that project, we saved them $700 million out of a $15 billion.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah,
more than I have.
I think their annual budget was $13 or $15 billion, and we saved them $700 million, which, we felt like we did a pretty good job. And some of that was that they were moving one facility from North Carolina to Puerto Rico or something where it was cheaper, and some people lose their jobs here, more people get jobs there. I don't know. I'm not going to make a moral judgment about Americans losing it. That's not the point. The point was you start to see meta patterns, and like you said, it's not they. There's no one person making an evil decision. Bristol Myers Squibb and every pharmaceutical company primarily allocates their resources towards drugs that are going to make them money.
Sure.
Now, it doesn't mean that the individual scientists aren't good people who are trying to save the world and save people's lives. Almost all of them are, I think.
Yeah.
But the things that get funded are the things that are going to make money. The things that get funded that would take, you could put a huge amount of money into something that'll be a treatment of a chronic condition or a chronic cancer or something, right? Because you got customers for a long time.
Sure.
All right, so there's a lot of money in that. So they'll put a lot of money into it because they know they're going to make a lot of money into it. But say there's other things where there's a kind of research where you could find a cure for something.
Right.
But that cure is going to end your money making.
Right. Yeah.
So less money gets put into that. It doesn't mean that there's any one person making an evil decision. It just means that if you could spend $80 million on a possibility of something resulting in a positive thing.
800 million.
But in doing something positive for human health, you could spend $80
Okay.
million here, $80 million here.
Right.
You could spend $80 million here. It'll improve somebody's health, and it'll make you $200 million. Or you could spend $80 million here, and if it works, it might produce a cure for something, but it won't make you much money.
Right.
Well, it's just really hard for a corporation to make that kind of decision.
Sure.
So it's a they that's not a they. It's not a conspiracy, but it's a they.
And I agree with you, and I see that. And that, to me, if we shift it just a little bit, and we talk about, you mentioned the finance industry, and they go and they do, these things, and I think what we're seeing now is pulling back on the regulations and the governance of those industries. Perhaps I might not be necessarily equating this to what you just said about Bristol Myers for logical reasons, but I see an equivalency in that if you had some oversight, in this case the government over the financial industry, that was not concerned with the bottom line, then you would minimize those types of things. And perhaps, for example, if we talk about our utopia, in our utopia there'll be the drug manufacturers that do their activities to make money, but then there'll also be a research arm that's
not profit motivated.
That's not profit motivated. That gets sufficient funds to develop cures to diseases that won't make them rich.
That's interesting. One of the there's a lot of people who say there's one thing that could change everything.
Yeah.
Right. And there's good arguments to be made for a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the biggest ones that I think is worth looking at more closely, because I've heard it from both right-wing and left-wing people,
mm-hmm.
is that up until the 70s, a company was judged internally and externally for success by many factors.
Yeah, sure, okay. And
how
now
many
it's only
jobs,
one.
how you treat your employees, how you spread the wealth, how you support a community, how you pursue a social mission, how you produce a good product that people use,
mm-hmm.
And how you produce returns for investors.
Right. And now in the
what
21st century,
there was a very specific set of economists who said, strip away everything else. The only thing that matters is shareholder value.
Sure.
And when they did that, it caused the incentives and the priorities of everything else to change. Because up until,
mm-hmm.
and the other piece of that was about the taxation puzzle, is that when you had and they were related.
Okay.
So if you had a very high marginal tax rate, it used to be as high as 90%.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a high-paid executive, you're only going to make, whatever it is, 10 cents on the dollar for every dollar above whatever that you get made. Right? So it made sense for companies, rather than spending a ton on the salaries of their high-end people, they just hired a lot more mid-level scientists and had much bigger research and development departments. Huge research and development departments. If they were a profitable company,
mm-hmm.
they had a huge chunk of their company, it could be 20% or something.
Mm-hmm.
Let's throw some smart people in a room, give them some equipment, and let them run wild.
Yeah.
Bell Labs, Draper Labs in MIT, like all these places, they just, smart people go wild, come up with something, maybe it'll turn into something profitable, but we're not going to even put pressure on that.
Okay.
We're just going to do cutting edge research because we can. But once you shifted over to this shareholder theory of value and you reduced the high-end marginal tax rates,
mm-hmm.
you had huge salaries for the executives, huge stock options for the executives,
mm-hmm.
and no more incentive to have an R&D.
Okay.
More incentive for people to cash out and stockholders to cash out.
Okay.
So it messed with, there was a certain balance where, I don't want to call it capitalism. Each of these things are versions of market economics and capitalism.
Right.
Always with some sorts of regulations and limitations.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing as pure capitalism.
Right.
That doesn't exist. But there's all sorts of ways that you can make the game have rules.
Yeah.
And when you change the rules a little bit, sometimes it
You
can
change
just...
the outcome.
Yeah, like it's like Wilt Chamberlain entering the NBA. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you're like, wait a second, if we keep the rules the way they are, this guy can dunk on every free throw. So they made it that you can't jump and dunk a free throw. Because he could.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, they literally changed the rules because it looked like it was going to break. So what we're seeing right now is there's all sorts of rules that the big, you know, either big players, billionaires or Goldman Sachs or whoever, they've realized they can just break the game.
Yeah, sure.
But they're paying off enough the politicians that they keep the game broken. And that's part of why we're leading to a revolution, is because a lot of this is hidden.
Yeah.
People are smart enough to know that they're being lied to and that the system isn't working right and things are getting not stolen from them, but they're getting squeezed.
Sure. And a couple of things. One, I'm not a sports guy, but I follow that analogy. and
You at least saw Wilt Chamberlain when you were alive.
I know who he is.
Yeah.
I may not have seen him in person, but I know who he is. Well,
Saw him on TV or something.
Right. I tell people that the biggest difference between my life in the United States and my life in Colombia is that in the United States, I didn't watch basketball, football, or baseball.
Yep.
And in Colombia, I don't watch soccer.
Oh, you don't?
I don't. I'm not a sports guy. And I'm still living in Colombia. I'm still not a sports guy.
Interesting.
So, revolution. I agree that is one of the big forces against which some entity will fight, will revolt.
Yeah.
And I think that perhaps why it hasn't happened yet, and why it may not happen for another number of years. For example, in you know the revolutions that we've witnessed, different revolutions against monarchies that came out with communism and came out with other types of government. I think it was really clear who was against who.
Yeah.
And here meaning in the United States in the 21st century, it's not yet clear. It's very, very multi-dynamic, multilateral, very multilateral. So we don't yet know.
Well, and I would even say the most important thing is that it's foggy. Meaning, like, nobody understands. No, I shouldn't say nobody. It seems like nobody in the public sphere is articulating a clear understanding of what the problems are, who the sides are,
and what the solution is. And that's why it hasn't happened yet.
But that's also why it's more dangerous. If you had that, it'd be less likely that there'd be a revolution, because then there'd be something you could get behind.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I don't
like the breakdown of
think
communication.
we can say what the outcome will be, or what the picture will be. I mean, if you revolt against the monarchy, it's clear we don't want a monarchy.
Yeah.
We're gonna put, let's say, again, I'm losing the word. We're gonna put, and you know what, the word that comes to mind is buffet, because in Spanish it'll be a buffet de abogados. So we want, I almost had it.
A buffet?
Yeah, we want a buffet. But we want a buffet. Everybody can eat. What we want is a committee. is a great committee that can legislate and make laws. So that's what we want in response to a monarchy, in response to one person.
Right.
So now, in response to the current state of affairs in the United States, for example, which is there's economic unrest, there's social unrest, there's political unrest, all of those things, and that's where as you said, it's foggy, and what are we going to put in place of that which we want to tumble?
Right.
Who knows?
And power is
Nobody
distributed
knows.
in such a weird way right now that I'm concerned that it'll take the form of, well, like, there's a lot of object lessons from Colombia. Colombia is emerging in the last couple of years from a period of 50 years of various kinds of civil war.
Yes.
So they had liberals against conservatives, 10 years of violence. Then they agreed to share power, but little splinter groups broke off and started guerrilla groups. Then you had this massive scaling up of narco trafficking because it was so wealth generating, but it came from the Colombian lower classes that it amounted to another side of the civil war of the lower classes against the upper classes. And then you had eventually the paramilitaries joining with some of the narcos, and the guerrillas either joining or taking over some of the narcos.
Right.
And you had America playing both sides, and
Sure.
So you had just this disaster for 50 years. Almost nobody was untouched by it. Rich families had people kidnapped. Poor, people were completely displaced. I think there's still 7 or 10 million people displaced in this country.
Yeah.
Just incredible disruption. Still have a class system. Indigenous people, black people on the coast still took the worst of it in a lot of ways. They're just emerging from this whole thing, and they're just figuring out how to talk about politics without pissing each other off. I notice that very strongly here, because it's such a contrast with America. And I notice in America this breakdown of communication.
Yeah.
That it's like anyone who disagrees with me is the devil, is a Nazi, is a communist. It's like is godless, is whatever. And it's just like, if you keep talking about and thinking about the other like that, it's eventually, and again, I'm not sure it's going to break down in those two sides or whatever, but once you have that erosion of people's trust that the system is working, something can break. It could be anything, you know what I mean? It could be like that one guy in Tunisia who set himself on fire, but any one thing could break, and then it's like all bets are off.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm worried about. I'm not worried about like left and right fighting each other as much as I'm worried about like all bets are off. And I don't know what it's going to look like.
The metaphor that comes to my mind is not all bets are off, but the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets complicated. There are lots of camels.
Okay.
And each is not necessarily at a point to where one straw. So you never know, or you don't know what straw is going to break what camel's back.
Right.
And if, okay, we'll mix metaphors. If that camel's back breaking becomes a domino theory, and you have many camel's backs breaking on down the line. For example, one camel, racial intolerance in the United States. That's a camel's back that can break.
Right. Sexism, patriarchy, Wall Street.
All of those are different. All of those are the different camels. Are the different
student loans. Any one of 100 of these things.
They're all the different camels' backs that can break or may break at a certain period of time, and then what happens?
And then what happens? Subprime was one of them. The subprime loans. There was a moment there in September or November 2008 where the bottom fell out, and for a few weeks it looked like everything might just sort of vaporize. Like it looked like the dollar might just completely lose value. It looked like the entire stock market might stop functioning. It looked like the entire the world economy might stop functioning. It looked like, just total like you said before, we act on these conventions that every other day means every other day.
Right.
And suddenly
it doesn't.
In that moment, there was a moment in late 2008 where it was like, I don't know what end is up. I don't know what's happening. And I think that they did that bailout. They bailed out the banks to save the world as it is. it might not have been the right decision.
So basically, something happens.
Yeah.
A camel's back breaks, and a fix is put in before other camels' backs can break.
Well, that's what happened in 2008.
Is that?
But it feels like
analogy?
what happened was in 2008 the system broke.
Right.
But none of us were ready for anything new. Not really. We didn't have any new direction to go. So they sort of stuck some, bubble gum and a little bit of straw.
Duct tape.
And duct taped it. And it's kind of there, but it's really fragile. And everybody knows that it's bullshit right now. But we don't have anywhere else to go. So we're all pretending that it still works, but it doesn't still work.
So here's my question. In terms of this revolution that we're talking about, that future revolution, is that what will happen again? Like will a camel's back break and someone will fix it with duct tape and then we'll carry on?
Well, I would think, I've studied revolutions. Revolutions are interesting. There's right-wing and left-wing revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom-up and top-down revolutions,
yeah,
so to speak.
But that's not what we're looking at now, I don't think.
Well, right now,
that's my
bigger point is I have no idea what kind of revolution we're looking at. I'm not sure if it's a revolution at all, or if it's just chaos, or civil war, or a breakdown.
And I'm calling it revolution, I guess, for lack of a better word, lack of a better term, because I don't necessarily know either. And I get that it's going to be many disparate forces erupting, perhaps against something, or perhaps erupting against something just as disparate and perhaps vague.
Well, sometimes a revolution doesn't mean political change overtly. Sometimes what it means is a universal change in accepted common sense.
Universal change in accepted common sense, as in the conventions that we use.
Well, okay,
like so every other day.
Before the French Revolution, the divine right of kings was taken for granted.
Yeah, okay.
Okay?
Sure.
American French Revolution, before that, king was a king. There was nowhere on earth that wasn't ruled by a king. Kings were hereditary and they got it from God.
Yeah.
And by 30, 50 years later, nobody in the world could claim legitimacy unless they also said the people support me. And that there's some ideal that people have rights.
Mm-hmm.
That was not a given. Now, that was not extended to all the peoples of the world, but within the Western countries, it was like total change in common sense. All people have rights, and even a king only has a right to be a king if they're supported by some sort of common assembly, some sort of voting, whatever.
Yeah, sure.
And, the same thing with the 60s. The 60s was a revolution, but it didn't necessarily overthrow any governments. But you had, in 1968, you had France. Well, France, they sort of overthrew. They have revolutions every couple of weeks in France. But it changed common sense about women and about... It was a crisis of inclusion. It was like women and black people said, we deserve a right to be treated as equals. And even though that goal has not been achieved, everybody now has to at least pay some degree of lip service to it since the 60s. That revolution did achieve that everybody now knows that you have to at least pretend that black people and women deserve a place at the table, and some opportunity, some sort of something.
And perhaps what we're facing now is
or at least to not be screwed.
Yeah, sure, and I agree, and perhaps what we're facing now, when we look at both from a racial perspective and the sexual or gender perspective, is the lip service that has been given, but the genuine change that has not taken place institutionally. And perhaps now...
It's creating tension.
Creating tension again.
Because they're not in alignment.
Right.
So it's like cognitive dissonance.
And perhaps this will be a true alignment, this revolution of which I speak. will be a true alignment. Like I saw a headline somewhere that I believe it was Norway just made it illegal to hire a woman to pay a woman less than a man. I'm assuming this, for an equal the equal job.
Yeah, Norway and Iceland. Although a lot of those statistics are a little weird because those countries have equalized opportunity so much. They're ahead of the rest of the world.
Right.
And what happens when you really equalize opportunity is that anyone can choose the career that they want. And disproportionately, women choose to go into careers that pay less. So there's not necessarily as much of a gender pay gap.
Right, but that's
there
why
still is one.
I didn't read the article, but I'm assuming
it's not as simple as people would like it to be.
Right.
So you're still getting this tension between, okay, we have an ideal that we theoretically all agree with, and then we have the reality, which is not that.
Yeah.
And if you go and this is the danger of the left, far left, like communism, is you say, okay, this and this are still far apart. We're going to force this to be this. Well, that almost always happens by killing a lot of people. Right? So you don't want to do that. But the right says, you know what? This and this is never going to happen. So let's throw this out and just accept this. Because this is okay, because this is the way God made the world. I mean, I'm making sort of an extreme argument of both of these cases, but both of those are real dangers.
Right.
And I don't think that left-right, it makes a lot of sense psychologically. That's kind of, this guy Jordan Peterson has a big philosophy about this. That there are types of people that lean towards this kind of thinking and this kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And it didn't always mean that those two kinds of people aligned with two kinds of political parties. But right now in America and in a lot of the West, it does. And that's dangerous.
Sure.
But I think that a way that's going to be a way forward, if we're not going to have that, so to speak, revolution be violent, is going to be something different. It could be negative, like a camel breaking, whatever, some sort of spark. It could be something positive. My hope is that there's some sort of better vision that we're all like, well, screw all these little debates. Let's do that. That's awesome. Yeah, like going to the moon, Okay. In a way, I think America...
Going to the moon coalesced and brought everybody together.
Yeah, like, we could be doing something...
a shared ideal.
A shared ideal that's a mission that, World War II did that. It's like...
Yeah.
That, for Americans, for British, for...
But World War II...
Let's put aside all our differences and let's achieve a common goal.
Yes and no. World War II did that for a certain group of people.
Yeah.
Black soldiers in particular, coming from this, it didn't do it. Well, black soldiers and black people in every war that the United States has fought, up until the civil rights in Vietnam, let's say, black soldiers fought side by side,
but we're still discriminated against.
And then came home, and were discriminated against. So it
right. And I respect Malcolm X for being like, I'm not going to serve in this war.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I think what did he pretended to be crazy when he got to the draft board.
That I don't know. But Malcolm X.
I think in his autobiography he describes
Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
So those. So that not I don't want to say grand ideal, but that sole idea that wasn't enough, and only did it to a certain depth.
Sure.
So I come to what will this
uniting against is never going to be as strong as uniting for. Well, actually, that might not be true. But
in World War II, were we not united against Germany, Nazism?
Well, we were united against.
We weren't united
the Japanese
for
attack.
Anything.
We were united against the Japanese attack, and then we were united against. Germany declared war on America. Germany declared war on America. It wasn't necessary.
Right. We didn't go into the war until Pearl Harbor.
Right. But the day after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on America for no apparent reason. That's a different that's a whole tangent. But
I mean,
I do think that there was a four, and this is where we tend to forget. FDR had been in power for 8, 9, 33 to 41 already as a peacetime president, with a positive vision of America that was unifying in many ways, like freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom, he did do a lot. I mean,
but
a lot of people saw him as a hero. I think even black people saw him as a hero. I mean, he did a lot in that era compared to what had been before, and black people mostly switched their allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party in the
But
30s.
It still wasn't anything, and anything he might have done was not as big as the big against that was World War II, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what is going to be
what could possibly unify or galvanize people,
right?
And I guess it doesn't have to galvanize everybody. Meaning, like in the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, it really was a pretty small number of people who were, and that's what there's right wing and left wing revolutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Revolutionary War, in some ways, was a right wing revolution.
Okay.
Ish, a conservative revolution. It was people who said
landowners and
such. and they have a society that they liked the way it worked.
Yeah.
It was revolutionary because it was a way for anyone from Europe to come start a brand new life and have a level of autonomy and freedom. It was a way to get out of all the religious wars of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way of having religious freedom, which didn't exist in the rest of the world.
Right.
It was a lot of positive things, and it was the only revolution ever done by political scientists.
Okay.
Who really had sophisticated debates. And there was this weird, combination of them from all the way from, Georgia up to Massachusetts, and having these conversations, knowing that they had very, very different economies and values and whatever, but saying, we agree against the king.
Mm-hmm. Right, okay.
But we also have this very measured view of the fallibility of humans, the fallibility of any individual human, the fallibility of group humans.
So they had, and they were able to conceptualize what they were going to put in place of the king.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I was trying to get at earlier. Yeah. That right now, I don't think there exists a clear conceptualization of what can be put in place of, and even, is there a clear conceptualization of what gets replaced?
Well, and I would take it one step back from that. I'm not sure right now that anyone has a clear conceptualization of what is. Yeah. And if you're not even dealing with the reality that it is, it's really hard to fix it.
Sure.
So my favorite,
I agree.
My favorite book recently is this book called Bullshit Jobs.
Okay.
By this guy David Graeber.
That's your favorite writer?
I would say he's the most important writer to me right now.
Okay.
Favorite nonfiction writer in my area of interest.
Okay.
He's written about the history of debt.
Uh-huh.
He's written about bureaucracy from an anthropological perspective.
Okay.
He's an anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wrote this book called Bullshit Jobs.
Okay.
And it came out of this random little essay that he wrote. And then he sort of solicited people to tell them about jobs that they were doing that they thought were bullshit.
Yeah.
And he got flooded. He was like, well, this is a real phenomenon. I need to look at this. So he did a real study and he worked.
Okay.
So it turns out somewhere in the range of 37 to 40% of jobs in the West don't need to exist at all.
Oh.
According to the people who do them.
That's very interesting.
Like, it's not just that, like, it's some sort of weird, theory of social value, like, does your job do any good? Oh, I'm going to say that it doesn't. No, you say it doesn't, and you're the one doing
the
it.
job.
So he wound up doing this really sophisticated analysis of, like, so there's certain people who are flunkies. That's pretty obvious. You're a rich person or the head of a corporation, whatever. They have someone around to make them look important, but they don't do anything. It's kind of bullshit, right?
Yeah. Oh.
So that's a flunky. Then there's goons. Goons are there to just intimidate other people,
Uh-huh.
but they really wouldn't need to be there unless other people had goons.
Okay.
So corporate lawyers fit this example. Like, really, these two corporations could do business just fine, but they both spend a huge amount of money on corporate lawyers to intimidate each other to try to not screw each other.
Okay.
So it's kind of useless,
Mhm.
right? Then there's box tickers. That's pretty obvious. You go around measuring things that don't need to be measured.
Yeah.
And it worked just fine without measuring those things, right?
Okay.
Then there's duct tapers,
Mm-hmm.
and that's people who go around fixing things that shouldn't be broken in the first place.
Okay.
Which is to say, like, okay, so you got a set of software, accounting software or something, but because at this stage of building the whole system, they were really cheap and they decided to use some free shareware and use a couple incompatible systems.
So it breaks.
So it regularly breaks, so you hire full-time people whose job every day is to reconcile the two formats that don't fit together. So it's a completely useless thing in the universe. It should not exist, but every day they have to duct tape it together.
Okay.
Right? And
Interesting.
there's a fifth category. But his point was, and this goes back to our flying cars thing,
Mm-hmm.
in the 30s people were worried that production was increasing so rapidly that really there'd be enough surplus production that most of us wouldn't need to work. That if we all worked 10 or 15 hours a week,
Yeah.
it'd be enough for us all to have food, housing, cars, whatever, right? And what this sort of pointed at is that we actually got there.
Right.
That a very small number of people produce everything that we need. All the food, distribution, transportation, housing, medicine,
Mm-hmm.
all the sort of backbone of what it takes to keep us all alive and communicating and functioning.
And just what we have is a distribution problem.
Well, it's like, rather than solving the distribution problem overtly and being honest about the reality,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of wound up creating this huge amount of fluff bullshit jobs
Okay.
in order to keep it that you have to work in order to get your place in this society where there's enough.
Right. Right.
And it's completely insane. Like, as an alien coming in and looking at our society, it's like, you guys have enough to make everybody be able to party all the time.
So why don't you?
Why don't you? Why do you have all these jobs? And people hate them. People
Yeah.
are miserable that 37 to 40% of people hate their jobs.
Right.
Or actually, it might even be higher than that. 37 to 40% of people think their jobs are bullshit. A complete waste of time. They get up every day and they do a job that they know
Yeah,
is a
and
waste
there's
of
a
time.
separate percentage of people that are in a job that they might not think is bullshit, but they hate it.
Right.
Those
Actually,
two separate things.
Yeah, he made a separate
there's something
category. So
else.
there's bullshit jobs, which are completely useless,
Mhm.
and then there's shit jobs.
Which the jobs people hate.
They're useful jobs, like, cleaning toilets or
But just-
whatever.
but
But
you still hate
it has a clear social utility. You might hate it, you might not,
Mhm.
but it has a clear social utility.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's jobs that you might hate for other reasons. You hate your boss, you hate your whatever. It might be a job that has value, but you still hate it.
Right.
So it's like, why would we, and I know we didn't design our society, but somehow collectively every day we're reinforcing the existence of this way of doing things.
Sure.
And
sure.
it's like, it just seems really stupid.
That's interesting because
So that's my hope of a revolution, is throw away all this right-wing, left-wing, race, gender, whatever. We have the possibility of having a society with tremendous abundance. Why don't we do that?
almost like a utopia.
It doesn't have to be a utopia in the sense, utopia is like,
Everything's perfect.
it literally means no place. And, I'm always skeptical of something where you're going to impose something.
Yeah.
But I feel like when there's certain kinds of emergencies, a lot of stuff gets stripped away, and suddenly people know how to live this way and share. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need a violent revolution to go in this direction if you do it right.
That's really interesting because it actually touches on a nerve. That's not the right expression. It touches on why I'm here in Colombia.
Okay.
Like, I left, and as I said, I didn't leave for social reasons. I left for my personal reasons. My last full-time job, I was a communications specialist, a marketer for a law firm. An AmLaw, it was an AmLaw 200, one of the 200 largest firms in the country, but also part of a professional services platform. I mean, big conservative company.
Uh-huh.
And I was fired from that job. I characterized myself as being, a polyhedron, or that was trying to fit into a square peg.
And an awful lot of people are, and they do tremendous damage to their own souls by trying to...
I physically got sick to being in that job. I physically got sick to the point to where I couldn't perform, and then ultimately I was fired. Then I kind of drifted around and didn't find a thing to do, and that exacerbated the mental illness.
Yeah.
Until finally I got an opportunity to come to Colombia, where I suspected things would be easier and better.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be the case. So now, 5 years later, I'm mentally healthy. I work freelance. I will never work for a company again.
Yeah.
Right. So
as an employee.
I will never work as an employee. I will never work for somebody. I mean, I have a client, and I choose how I'm going to service that client.
You're never going to be a slave again.
I'm never going
No, it's a real thing. It's a very real thing.
And so you're talking about, okay, you're talking about that sort of thing happening in mass in one place. That happened for me. I somehow found a way for it to happen, and it took leaving the country. So it's just very...
For your personal growth to happen, or to see that with clarity?
No, for my personal growth to happen. For me to get out of the quote unquote rat race, or that system that literally was killing me.
Yeah.
Right? That literally made me sick physically and mentally. Now, 5 years later, I'm physically and mentally healthy, and I have developed a system where I can work and produce and do so in a healthy...
More than enough to break even for the cost of living here.
Yes. Now, conceivably, I might have found that in the United States, because I realized I have to work freelance.
Right.
And working freelance has a certain set of stressors, but I'm more comfortable with those set of stressors than I am with the set of stressors that comes with working for somebody. Right? So I accept that. I accept the working for myself and the set of stressors that comes with. And it's very interesting and curious to me if that can happen or will happen on a grand scale.
Well, what's the nerve? It hit a nerve.
I chose the wrong analogy. It hits home.
It hits home.
It hits home to me because that
because
is
you're able to choose.
That
not
personally
to
is
bullshit.
what happened to me.
Okay.
I had to break out of the system.
Yep.
And part of that breaking out entailed me relocating overseas. I don't think that maybe helped it happen sooner. I probably would have stumbled upon it eventually, even if I stayed in the United States. Just the fact that, look, Gregory, the way you need to work is working freelance or setting up your own business, and then you're able to do it.
That's interesting, because I left America similarly, but I wasn't burned out because I was a round peg in a square hole.
Mm-hmm.
I had my own company.
Mm-hmm.
I started my own company. Actually, I started it in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I moved it to America because it's the much bigger market, and it felt like it was the right place to do it. And I tried really, really hard to, and it was, in a way, the most exciting and rewarding thing I'd ever done, was being CEO, founder, fundraiser, raising capital, hiring people, managing the tech people, trying to manage the business people. I was never as good at hiring business and sales people as I was at hiring tech people, so that's part of why we didn't. Well, we came close to succeeding, and in a way, I'm not sure that we failed as much as, because things were going okay, and we kept getting little bits of business and hopes for something much bigger, and a door would open, and another door would open, but sales cycles are slow, and maybe we get a huge contract with. We got one with BMW, and we thought it would be bigger. We got with MIT, and we thought it would be bigger. We got into Johns Hopkins and Mass General. We thought we'd have this huge thing that would be for hospitals and medical, whatever. It's my startup's a whole long story, but we were at the point where we got into a conversation with an investment group to do a much bigger investment. We'd raised smaller amounts, but we had a whole conversation with them and stuff signed and back and forth, and we thought we were going to get a $500,000 investment. This is November 6, 2016, or October 2016. And somehow 2 weeks goes by, and I'm finally like, wait, I thought the check isn't on the way. Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And then finally they said, well, we decided that we don't want to be the only investor right now. We want other investors to go in. So why don't you go and see if you can find some other investors, and then maybe we'll do this whole round with you.
Yeah.
That's not bad feedback. You know what I mean? It's not a clear no. They sort of said yes. They wanted to say yes. Clearly there was like some people in their group who were like, we love it. We want to put money in. But they do it. Okay, so whatever. That shouldn't have been a deal breaker, but somehow I'd been working so hard for so long, and the nature of that conversation got my hopes up so much.
Sure.
And added some other factors. I hadn't been sleeping well for a while, working too hard. I had a car accident. I had some PTSD from the car accident, not sleeping well. And when I found out that investment wasn't happening, I couldn't get out of bed the next morning or the morning after that. And I was done.
Yeah.
The business, it could have been, maybe it still could be, but I couldn't keep working at all.
Yeah.
I was like a puddle. And for several months, I couldn't work at all. And when I came down to Columbia, so it was a form of getting out of the rat race.
Right.
And part of what's great about being down here is that it's just so much cheaper because I'm just less stressed. My rent is a quarter, less of what it would be there. The how much money it takes to get by each month, I can breathe easier and just so much less stress because it's cheaper.
It's two things for me. It's that, and it's, in general, folks enjoy their lives here more.
Yeah, they're more optimistic.
And so I think that's something we tap into, because in the United States, I don't think we enjoy our lives that much. We work.
And I wonder also, that's certainly true. Your identity is wrapped up in your work more in America. But I wonder also if people like you and me and some other people, maybe we are just happier as expats. That's something about just being in another place, another language, being a sort of outsider. I wonder if that's a piece of it.
There is that. I remember a couple of things about living in New York, and one of those is walking after I would leave whatever job.
Because I think immigrants in America are happier.
Immigrants in America are happier than U.S. citizens? Yes. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Interesting.
New immigrants.
Interesting.
They really see it as an opportunity.
New immigrants.
Yeah.
Not the old immigrants.
Not the old immigrants.
Yeah. But when I was walking in New York. I would if I worked. There was a time where I worked near 14th Street.
Yeah.
And I would get out of work 5:30, and walk, and I would walk up into 80-something Street before I got on the train to get. And I look back and I'm like, I was searching for something. There's just a physical unrest.
Yeah.
Some of that is endemic to New York.
And New York's such a walkable city, which is really magical.
Yeah. So
I love walking around Manhattan.
And so there is probably something to that. I like being an expat, and I like being someplace where I speak a different language. I mean, that's just, I don't know what it is. Maybe a friend of mine said, "Yeah, Greg, doing things in English is just too easy for you." I do like to make things difficult for myself. I do.
Okay.
I do. I'm working on doing that less. But there is something about doing all of the day-to-day stuff in Spanish that is, it just, I don't know, it adds an extra depth and dynamism to it that I just don't get in the States.
Yep.
So maybe, there's probably something too. There is a personality type that will enjoy being outside of the country.
Right, and I wonder if even if it was in like Australia or England or something, it's still English, but it would feel.
It might.
It might have some of that dynamism for you because it's different.
It might be. I've only experienced. I've only experienced other countries that speak different languages. I've never been. The only country I've been to that speaks English is Toronto. Is Canada. Think about it.
That's a good line. Toronto's its own country.
I've only been to Canada. I've never been to
England,
or Australia, and even I went to Africa. I went to Togo, and they speak French. That's interesting. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I speak French and some Hebrew. I feel like my Hebrew, it should be a lot better than it is because I was there for 10 years, but my Spanish is now overlaying the Hebrew in my brain.
Yeah.
It's like confusing.
But as you mentioned that, I'm thinking, wow, I'm actually just theorizing going to Israel, and I get more excited about that than theorizing going to England.
Right.
So maybe it's a language thing. Is it that challenge? Because I don't speak Hebrew.
Right. It's just to be somewhere really new.
Yeah, and when I was in France and Togo, I was exhilarated by that process of learning French and using the 7 French words and kind of expanding that and by the end of my stay there, I knew 14 French words.
Well, I wonder too about this sort of like the right wing ideal of free market capitalism is like unrestricted freedom so that it can self-regulate, right? Now that of course takes certain tweaks because you have to have things like contract enforcement and whatever. Like you can't just have anyone freely scam anyone else.
Right.
You have to have some restrictions on debt, for example, because if you can lend to anyone anything, well, if you say, well, I got a great tip on a horse, I want to go bet $100 grand on a horse, give me $100 grand, and I'm allowed to give you that $100 grand. That's just a way of me owning you. That you're going to be paying me back $100,000 for the next few years.
Right.
It has to be regulated in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
But what pisses me off about a lot of those right-wing ideologues is that they support free movement of goods. Great, you should be able to move, your coffee from Colombia to England, and you should be able to invest, bring money in from Hong Kong or from America to invest in a farm here in Colombia or whatever. But that system, that ideal, that flow, only really makes sense if there's also free movement of labor.
Okay.
And if you don't have borders, that would be fine. And I'm not talking from a nationalistic perspective. I'm saying from an economic perspective. If you believe in that ideal of freedom, then you got to let people move around to wherever the jobs are, so that it equalizes the labor and they can make free choices about how much they'll take a job for.
And right now, that ideal is hampered by
national borders. So you and I with American passports, we can go most places with relatively few restrictions. And, okay, it might take us a few months to get a work visa in a different place, but we don't have the barriers that a Filipino does or a Guatemalan does getting to another place,
or even a Colombian going to the United States.
Colombians have a lot of trouble.
Sure.
So maybe this ideal of abundance that I keep trying to grasp at articulating is that if it's true that the abundance that supports our world is produced by only 10-20% of the people or less.
Yeah.
Maybe we could just sort of identify that part and say that part works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now everybody else gets from it,
Mm-hmm.
and we re-examine how do we do this and where do we want to be. We've been on for 2.5 hours, so I think we should wrap up this particular conversation.
Fantastic. Time flies.
Time flies. Any last thoughts?
My last thought is back to our age difference. What generation are you?
I don't know, Gen X, I guess.
Yeah. I recently posted on Facebook a question. Where's Generation X and Y? What happened to them? All we hear is millennials. And while I don't feel like a baby boomer, technically I am. I'm right at the edge.
You're at the tail end of baby
I'm at the
boomer.
tail edge. And I don't necessarily feel like a baby boomer, because when you think about baby boomers, you think about people that came of age after World War II.
And you came
I
of
was
age kind of after Vietnam.
well, yeah, exactly. I was born in '62, so I couldn't come of age, in World War II. And are the times of generations compressing?
Well, because of, it's funny, even though I was saying the pace of radical change has slowed,
Mm-hmm.
1880s to the 1960s, we're getting from having sanitation to going to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
But from the 70s on, our big changes have stalled out. We're still, the bullet trains are still from the 1950s.
Yeah.
And there's not much improvement in our macro lives.
Yeah.
But our informational lives is changing very rapidly. The information we're presented, our ways of processing information, our ways of interacting with each other and connecting with each other around the world
Mm-hmm.
is changing very rapidly. I'm not sure it's advancing as much as it's sort of like it's almost like you could read a book and then you could speed read a book and then you could super speed read a book. And I feel like all we're moving towards is like we're super speed reading, but none of us are comprehending anymore. So yes, the generations are changing quicker in terms of the level of incoherence. But I'm not sure that we're improving.
But even
each generation
definition wise.
Yes, that's true. Each 4 or 6 or 8 years seems to be conceiving of reality differently.
Yeah.
And it's only adding to the incoherence. I mean, incoherence in the sense of different groups of people thinking differently could be positive. I think that's part of what New York was always so great, was when you had side by side these different immigrant groups and longtime New Yorkers sort of rubbing shoulders and trying to figure out how to coexist and appreciating each other's food and maybe bitching at each other, but like really interacting and learning from each other whether they wanted to or not. That can be really positive.
But you're suggesting now that we're coming up to a true incoherence. There's a monumental amount of information, and we're not processing it.
Well, my friend,
we're receiving it but not processing it.
My friend Matt Blumberg has a kind of theory that the way that we're functioning as a collective intelligence, what you see happening in media and online and social media and governments, and the way this is functioning is similar to a schizophrenic person. In that it's like, it's not that schizophrenics can't. Well, I'm not a neuroscientist, whatever. I'm going to butcher this definition, but at any given point in time, there's a lot of sensory information coming in to your, wherever that point in your head is where you're thinking
where
and
you're processing it.
Right? So right now, there's this light, the light from my computer, there's the little glowing blue light from my phone where it's recording, and then there's background. And there's background noise, and if we tuned into it, we'd hear the background noise of the city and the hum of the refrigerator and a bunch of things. And you and I are relatively not schizophrenic, and so therefore we're able to filter out a lot of the unnecessary stuff and focus on the sound and meaning of each other's voice and body language.
Yeah.
Okay? So supposedly a schizophrenic person, it's like
Cannot do that
can't
degree of discernment.
They can't turn down the volume on all the other things.
Yeah.
Including the voices in their head. Because you're having thoughts pop up in your own head, and that's part of what makes this conversation powerful. But you're able to differentiate
Right.
and turn up and down the volume on different things. So what we're having is a processing problem that as a society we have a tremendous amount of information, but we're not able to amplify and filter out the signal from the noise.
Right.
So somehow our society has decided that we should be arguing about, children at the border being separated from their families, and gay marriage, and trans definitions, and Caitlyn Jenner and the Kardashians, and I don't know,
A dozen other things.
a dozen other things that may or may not be meaningful or significant, but are they as important as the shifts in the way that the investment banks and the super billionaires are altering the practice of a certain way of macro lending that is causing entire countries to go bankrupt, but we don't even have the tools to understand it, much less understand that that's way more important than the argument about who called so-and-so a so-and-so and which comedian said the wrong stupid thing.
Yeah.
Or somebody who grabbed somebody's ass 30 years ago.
So what we have to do is redefine what schizophrenia is.
Okay.
I'll bring us back to the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah.
We're talking about concepts and shared conceptualizations and shared definitions and context.
Yes.
And so if we're all at a stage to where we don't distinguish between the signals or the intensity of the signals, or we're not able to de-intensify a signal, then we're all schizophrenic. And what we need to do is redefine that as something normal so that we're not crazy.
Ha! I like that. So there's a
doesn't solve the problem. It's just redefining.
There's an old folk tale. I learned it from the Jewish tradition, but I think it exists in some other traditions too.
Mm-hmm.
That the king of some kingdom and his minister. So the minister comes to him and says they discovered that the wheat harvest is rotten.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so the tainted wheat. If people eat it, they're going to go mad.
Mm-hmm.
So some people think this relates to the argot rot, which is similar to the LSD compound.
Okay.
Okay, so it might actually have some basis in reality. But anyway, the king and his minister, they say, okay, we have a tiny little supply here in the castle of some non-tainted wheat.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I and our families could just eat this wheat. But everybody else in the kingdom, they're going to either have to eat the tainted wheat or they're all going to starve. Because there's big granaries and whatever.
Right.
So what do we do? Because if they all eat the tainted wheat and we don't, they are going to all be crazy. And we're not going to be. But they're going to think we're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But if we ate tainted wheat also, we're going to be crazy.
We will be crazy.
So what do we do? So, and I'm not getting all the details of the story, but basically what they decide to do, they say, you know what? The best thing is we're going to eat the tainted wheat also. But we're going to put a mark on each other's forehead so that when we look at each other, we can remind each other that we're crazy. So at least we'll know.
At least we'll know.
So that might be the best we can do right now. All right. A little mark. Gregory, thank you for joining the Left In podcast.
Thank you for having me. It has been a pleasure. It's been a true pleasure.
Absolutely.